You sent that to the wrong man, Caius Draven said, and his voice carried no warmth. No surprise. No flicker of anything that could be mistaken for human inconvenience, only the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who had already decided how this night would end before she had any idea it had begun. Sienna Voss had been standing on the sidewalk outside her own apartment building in the kind of November cold that made Chicago feel like a punishment, her suitcase at her feet and her phone still glowing in her hand. And the text she had meant to send to Elliot Vane 3 years of her life, compressed into 42 words, ending with, "Don't call me," had gone somewhere else entirely. To a number she didn't recognize. To a man she had never heard of. And that man, instead of ignoring it or sending back a confused reply, had written back 2 words, "Come over." She should have apologized and hung up. She should have called her sister, or her friend Jade from the office, or literally anyone whose last name she already knew. Instead, she was standing outside a wrought iron gate in a neighborhood where the houses had names, watching a man she'd never seen before open a front door that cost more than her yearly salary, and thinking that she had made either the best or the worst decision of her 28 years on this earth. His name was Caius Draven. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was the way he looked at the screen of his own phone for exactly 3 seconds before he looked at her, and whatever crossed his face in those 3 seconds was something she would spend the next several weeks trying to identify. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't relief. It was something colder and more deliberate than either of those things. Like a man who had just confirmed a calculation he'd been running in his head for a long time. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, because this story is about to take you somewhere you did not expect. Like this video and stay with me, because you need to see how far this goes. Now let's go back to the beginning. 3 hours before Sienna Voss sent a breakup text to the wrong number. She came home to find Elliot Vane sitting in her kitchen with a glass of her wine and a face arranged into an expression she recognized as his apology face, the one he deployed like a tactical instrument. Soft around the eyes, jaw slightly loose, designed to make her feel guilty for whatever she was about to say before she said it. He had moved in 8 months ago, which had felt like a natural progression at the time, and now felt like a slow flood she hadn't noticed until the water was at her throat. She set her bag down on the counter with a steadiness she didn't feel, poured herself a glass of water instead of wine, and said, very carefully, that they needed to talk. What followed was 40 minutes of Elliot talking and Sienna listening, which had been the architecture of their relationship for the better part of a year. He was sorry. He had been under pressure. The new position at the firm took more out of him than he expected. He didn't mean to make her feel invisible. She had heard variations of this speech enough times that she could predict the paragraph breaks. And somewhere around the 20-minute mark, she stopped listening to the words and started listening to the silence underneath them. The silence where he did not ask how she was doing. The silence where he did not ask what she needed. The silence where he talked about himself under the grammar of an apology and expected her to receive it as love. She waited until he finished. Then she told him she wanted him to move out. The apology face collapsed and was replaced by the other face, the one that was quieter and harder. The one that reminded her that Elliot Vane was very good at seeming soft until he wasn't. He told her she was being irrational. He told her she was letting her anxiety make decisions for her. He told her she would regret this. He left before she did, which meant she was the one who grabbed her already half-packed suitcase from the closet. She had been packing it slowly for 3 weeks without admitting to herself what she was doing, and walked out of the apartment that was technically in her name but had somehow stopped feeling like hers. She sat in the stairwell on the 4th floor for 6 minutes. Then she pulled up her contacts to find Jade's number, fumbled in the dark, and sent the text she had been composing in her head for a week to the number directly above Jade's in her list. She didn't notice until the reply came back. Come over. Not a question. Not, are you okay? Not who is this? Just an address on the North Shore. And a single follow-up message 30 seconds later, the gate will be open. She stared at the screen for a long time, The address was 40 minutes away by rideshare. She had nowhere else to go. Her sister was in Phoenix. Jade wasn't answering, and the idea of sitting in a hotel room by herself with the particular silence of a decision she couldn't take back felt like more than she could manage right now. She told herself she would go, see that it was clearly a mistake, apologize, and leave. She did not leave for 17 days. The gate was open. Exactly as promised, black iron swung inward before her car had fully stopped, which meant someone had been watching. The driveway curved through grounds that were too deliberate to be called a yard. Mature oak trees spaced at intervals that suggested they had been planted with a specific purpose in mind. The house itself came into view in sections, the way significant things sometimes did, and by the time she saw the whole of it, 3 stories of pale stone, clean lines. Every light in the ground floor burning, she had the specific feeling of having stepped into a world that had its own rules, its own gravity, its own version of time. She almost told the driver to turn around. She got out instead. The front door opened before she reached it, and the man in the doorway was not what she expected. Though she had not known what she was expecting until the moment she saw him and understood it was not this. Caius Draven was tall in a way that rearranged the space around him. Dark suit, no tie, the collar of a white shirt open at the throat. His left hand was wrapped in clean bandaging from the wrist to the base of his fingers. Recent. Professional. Hiding something she didn't ask about. He was looking at his phone when she came up the steps, and she watched him read something on the screen before his eyes came up to her face. And there it was, that 3-second calculation. Whatever he had just read, whatever he had just confirmed, settled behind his expression like a stone dropped into deep water. No ripple. You sent that to the wrong man, he said. His voice was low and even, and carried a precision that made everything else around it seem imprecise by comparison. I know, Sienna said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. I'm sorry. I don't know how it happened. I'll go. She was already half turning back toward the car when he said, without raising his voice. The driver already left. She turned back. He was right. The taillights were gone. She stood on his front steps in the Chicago cold, her suitcase beside her and her dignity somewhere back on the 4th-floor stairwell of her apartment building, and said, I can call another one. You can. He agreed. Or you can come inside. He said it the way someone might hold a door open, not warmly. Not as an invitation, but as a statement of options. Take it or leave it. She thought about the hotel room. She thought about the silence. She picked up her suitcase and walked through the door. The inside of the house was the inside of a decision. She thought everything chosen with the kind of deliberate restraint that was more expensive than decoration. The foyer was white marble and dark wood and a staircase that swept up and away. No clutter. No softness. A single painting on the wall to her left, abstract and large and the color of a storm moving over open water. He didn't give her a tour. He led her through a hallway and into a kitchen that was twice the size of her apartment's living room and stood at the far counter without asking if she wanted anything, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass that he set on the island. Not in front of her. In the center, neutral ground. She didn't take it. He didn't push it. What's his name? He said, and he was looking at the counter. Not at her. Whose name? The man you were leaving. It was a strange way to phrase it, not who you were texting. Not who you meant to send that to. The man you were leaving, like he had already assigned a role and a direction and an outcome. Elliot, she said. Elliot Vane. He didn't react. Not a blink. Not a shift. Not the tiny tightening around the jaw that she would later learn to watch for. He looked up from the counter and said, There's a room at the top of the stairs on the left. The door locks from the inside. She blinked. I'm not staying. Your suitcase is already here, he said, with the maddening reasonableness of someone who had anticipated every counter-argument and found all of them insufficient. One night, she said, It was the most negotiation she had managed all evening. He looked at her for a moment that was exactly one beat too long, the kind of look that catalogued rather than connected. And then he turned back to the counter and said, "One night, she took her suitcase to the room at the top of the stairs on the left. The door had a lock. She used it. She lay on the bed, which was large and white, and said nothing about the man who owned this house, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way he had said Elliot Vane's name, or rather, the way he had not said it. The absolute stillness of him in the moment she gave him that name. And she thought that the stillness was wrong in a way she could not articulate yet. She turned it over in her mind the way you turned over a stone that was too smooth, too flat, too perfect to have been shaped only by water. She was asleep before she could find the right question to ask about it. She woke at 6 in the morning to the sound of voices below her, low, controlled. The particular cadence of people who were accustomed to discussing serious things quietly. She lay still and listened without meaning to, catching nothing intelligible through the floor. Only the rhythm of it, 2 voices. Then 3. Then 2 again. Then silence followed by a door closing somewhere in the house. She got up and washed her face in the attached bathroom, which had towels folded with geometric precision and a soap dispenser that was full and a mirror that showed her a woman who had slept in her clothes, whose eyes had the slightly stunned look of someone who had not yet caught up to the events of her own life. She put her hair up and went downstairs. He was in the kitchen again, standing at the window with a coffee cup, dressed differently now, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, the bandaging on his left hand still clean and tight. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and something cold coming through a window cracked an inch above the sink. He didn't turn around when she came in, but he said, "There's coffee," and she understood that he had heard her on the stairs and chosen not to acknowledge it until she was in the room. She poured herself a cup and stood on the opposite side of the island, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence had a strange quality to it, not uncomfortable. Exactly. But layered. Like a room that held more furniture than you could see at first. "I should call a car," she said. "I can find somewhere to go." "Your bank account has been frozen," he said, still looking out the window. "The joint one, and the savings account linked to it." She set down her coffee cup very carefully. "How do you know that?" He turned from the window then and looked at her with the same leveled expression she was beginning to understand was simply the architecture of his face, not coldness. Exactly. But a kind of permanent readiness. The face of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. "Because someone filed a missing persons report at 11:47 last night," he said, "under the name Sienna Voss. The person who filed it had access to your shared financial accounts." She heard her own heartbeat for a moment. Very clearly. He filed a missing persons report. "It's a useful move," Caius said, without particular judgment. "It creates a paper trail that positions you as irrational or unstable. It also freezes any joint assets during an active investigation. And it means that if you use a card or check into a hotel, there is a flag." She stood very still and thought about the man she had lived with for 8 months, the apology face and the other face underneath it. And she thought about how she had told herself the other face wasn't really who he was, that it was the pressure talking, the job talking, the stress talking. She thought about all the things she had allowed to talk when she should have been listening to herself. "He can't actually hold the accounts," she said. "He's not on the main lease. I can call the bank." "You can," Caius agreed. "It will take 3 to 5 business days to resolve through standard channels, or it can be resolved this morning." He picked up his coffee cup and turned back to the window. "Your choice." She looked at his profile for a moment, the clean angle of his jaw, the particular stillness of him that she kept bumping up against, like a wall she hadn't seen. "Why would you do that?" she said. "You don't know me." He was quiet for a beat, and then he said, "You sent a text to a number you didn't recognize and got into a car to come here alone at midnight. You're not someone who needs to be known before someone helps you." He paused. You're someone who needs to be helped before she realizes she should have asked more questions. It was the most he had said to her at once. And it landed strangely not quite a compliment. Not quite a criticism. Something in between that acknowledged her without pitying her. She picked up her coffee cup again. "What's your name?" she said. Because it occurred to her with some embarrassment that she had slept in this man's house without knowing his name. "Caius," he said. "Caius Draven." She waited for it to mean something to her. It didn't, not yet. "Cien na vos," she said, even though he obviously already knew. "Thank you for the room." The left corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "Don't thank me yet," he said. It was not a threat. She understood that even then. In the kitchen, with the coffee warming her hands and the morning light coming gray through the cracked window, it was something closer to a warning, and it was directed at her own tendency to decide too quickly that things were fine, that people were trustworthy, that a situation was simpler than it was. She had spent 3 years doing that with Elliot. She thought she recognized the shape of the correction. She did not yet know how much bigger the real warning was, or how long it would take her to need it. She stayed a second night, and then a third, because the bank issue required documentation she had to retrieve, and then because Elliot's lawyer sent a letter to her apartment building management claiming she had abandoned the lease, which it was legally improbable but structurally destabilizing enough to require a response, and then because a week had passed and her suitcase was still in the room at the top of the left stairs and she had started leaving a probable coffee cup on the counter in the mornings that he had not once asked her to put away. She explored the house in increments. The way you explored a city you weren't sure you were allowed to be in. The ground floor was open and ordered living room, study with a closed door, dining room that seemed never to have been used for actual dining, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a reading chair positioned to face the window. She found herself in the library on the 4th afternoon, sitting in that chair with a book she had pulled mostly at random. And when Caius came through on his way somewhere else and stopped in the doorway, neither of them said anything for a moment. "The Cortázar," he said, glancing at the spine. Good choice for someone who is not sure what is real. She looked down at the book. Is that what it's about? Among other things. He moved on. She stayed in the chair for another hour and thought about what he had said and could not decide if he had been talking about the book. There were rooms he did not open. The study with the closed door she had noticed on the first morning. A room on the second floor at the far end of the hall from hers, with a door that was always closed and that she noticed he sometimes stood outside of, not reaching for the handle, just standing there, the way people stood outside rooms they were not yet ready to enter. She did not ask about it. It was the kind of thing you did not ask about until you were asked to ask. And she was still in the phase of understanding that this house ran on its own timing, that Caius Draven operated on a frequency slightly slower and slightly more deliberate than the rest of the world, and that the right response to most things in his vicinity was patience she was not naturally inclined to have. On the 5th day, he taught her something without meaning to, or perhaps he did mean to. She was never entirely sure. He was driving her to the law office where she needed to sign documents regarding the lease, and they were stopped at a light on Michigan Avenue when he said, very quietly, "Don't look directly. Gray, sedan. 2 cars back on your left. It's been behind us since we left the house." She did not look directly. She looked at the passenger side mirror instead, and saw the gray car, and thought about Elliot knowing her bank information, and Elliot filing a missing persons report, and Elliot's face in the kitchen with its practiced softness. And something cold settled in her chest that was not quite fear, and not quite anger, but somewhere between them. Denser than either. "Is that normal?" she said. "For someone like him. Depends on what he's protecting." Caius said. The light changed and he turned right without signaling. And after 2 more turns, the gray car was gone. And he didn't mention it again. That evening they had dinner together for the first time without it being the result of proximity or convenience he had cooked, which surprised her. Nothing elaborate. pasta with a sauce that was better than it had any right to be from someone who seemed to approach most things as operational problems rather than pleasures. They sat across from each other at the kitchen island and she talked, more than she had intended to. She told him about her sister in Phoenix and how they had grown up moving every 3 years because of their father's work, and how she had learned to make herself useful in new places as a survival mechanism. She told him about the job at the architecture firm and how she had spent 5 years on other people's visions and had a drawer full of her own sketches she hadn't shown anyone. He asked questions direct, specific questions that were nothing like the ones Elliot had asked, which had always been oriented toward her as a supporting character in his story. Caius asked about the sketches. He asked what kind of buildings she drew when no one was watching. He asked what she thought the city looked like from the 42nd floor at night versus the street, and whether she thought that difference mattered. It was the most anyone had interrogated her about what she actually thought in longer than she could remember. And by the time she realized she had been talking for an hour and a half, she was also aware that he had answered almost nothing about himself and that she had somehow not noticed. "You're very good at asking questions," she said. "Useful habit," he said, "and very bad at answering them." He looked at her over the rim of his glass, and something shifted in his expression, not the calculation she had seen on the first night, something slightly different, a degree of appraisal that was warmer and more careful. "Ask me something specific," he said. She thought about it. "The room at the end of the hall upstairs," she said. "The one you stand outside of." The appraisal closed. Slowly. Cleanly. Like a shutter. "That wasn't specific enough," he said, and picked up his glass. And she understood that she had found an edge she wasn't going to be allowed past tonight. She filed it away. She was getting good at filing things away in this house, at understanding that information arrived here in a particular order that she had not yet learned to read. She suspected that Caius Draven always knew more than he said, and that the gap between what he knew and what he said was not carelessness but architecture, in the same kind of deliberate restraint that governed everything else in this house. She suspected this without understanding yet what was on the other side of that architecture, or what it was built to hold. On the 7th night, as she was in the library past midnight when she heard him on the phone in the hallway, his voice below conversational level, and caught 4 words through the closed-door vein. "Not yet. Wait." She sat with the book open in her lap and those 4 words in her chest and told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations, and did not quite believe any of them. She closed the book and sat in the dark library and did not go to sleep for a long time. Below her, the house breathed its particular silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full, weighted with things she didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. The gray car had been behind them on Michigan Avenue. Elliot had filed a missing persons report within hours of her leaving, and the man who had offered her a room without asking for anything in return had just said her ex-fiancée's name on a phone call he didn't know she could hear. 3 facts. She arranged them in her mind and looked at the shape they made together. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself she was stressed and exhausted and her pattern recognition was misfiring, pulling conspiracy from coincidence, threat from coincidence. She was very good at talking herself out of her own instincts. She had been doing it for 3 years. She turned off the library light and went upstairs and locked the door from the inside, exactly as she had been told she could, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle and thought that the lock was there because Caius Draven had told her it was there, and she didn't know yet whether that was safety or architecture of a different kind. She fell asleep with the question still open. In the morning, like every morning in this house, there was coffee waiting and nothing explained. On the 9th day, Sienna found a florist's arrangement on the kitchen island when she came down for coffee, 12 white roses in a crystal vase, the kind of arrangement that had been designed to look effortless and cost more than it should. She stood in front of it for a long moment before she saw the card tucked between the stems, and she did not touch it, because something in her had already decided she did not want to read it without a witness. And Caius was not in the kitchen. She found him in the hallway outside his study with a phone pressed to his ear, and he looked at her face and ended the call without a word to whoever was on the other end. She said, "There are flowers on the kitchen counter." He walked past her to the kitchen and looked at the arrangement. And something happened in the set of his shoulders, a tightening so small she almost missed it. Like a spring being compressed. He took the card from between the stems without opening it, looked at the envelope for exactly 2 seconds, and then said, "Go get your coat." She didn't ask why. She was learning not to ask why in the first instance with him, because the answer always came eventually. And asking prematurely only made her seem more unsettled than she was. She got her coat. They drove north in a black car with tinted windows. His regular driver a silent, broad-shouldered man named Rafe who had a face that gave nothing and eyes that gave everything. And after 20 minutes, Caius handed her the card without a word. She opened it. In Elliot's handwriting, in blue ink, "I know where you are. Come home and we can fix this. If you're not home by Friday, I'll have to tell them where you went." She read it twice. Tell who, she said. Tell them what. Caius was looking out the passenger window at the lakefront moving past. The water iron gray in November light. "That's the right question," he said, which was not an answer. She folded the card and put it in her coat pocket and looked out her own window and thought about the verb Elliot had chosen. Not warn. Tell, as if he had an audience. And, as if what he told them would have consequences she hadn't yet calculated. It was Rafe who taught her the car trick. Technically, Caius had told her what to look for on Michigan Avenue, but it was Rafe, 3 days later, who explained it in terms she could use. They were in the parking garage below a building where Caius had a meeting Sienna was not invited to attend. And Rafe was leaning against the car with his arms crossed and his eyes doing that particular sweep of the exits that she had started to notice people in this house always did. Automatic as breathing. And she said, "How do you know which one is watching?" He looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether to answer. Then he said, "Pattern breaks. A car that goes where you go but never arrives. A person who turns when you turn and stops when you stop but never looks at you directly, because looking directly is what amateurs do." He paused. "Your guys are amateur." She filed that away too. Your guys. As if Elliot were an established entity in Rafe's landscape, already categorized, already placed. She did not ask how long Elliot had been in that landscape. She had started making a list, in the Notes app on her phone, of all the things she didn't ask but intended to. On the 11th day, Jade finally called back. Sienna took it in the library with the door closed, sitting in the reading chair with her feet tucked under her, and Jade said she was so sorry. Her phone had been stolen in Philadelphia, and she'd only just gotten a replacement, and she'd been frantic since she heard from a mutual friend that Elliot had filed a missing persons report. Sienna told her she was fine. She told her she was staying with a friend. She gave Jade the number of her own lawyer and told her not to speak to Elliot or anyone connected to him. And Jade, who was smart and who had never entirely trusted Elliot in the way that good friends sometimes saw things you refused to, said, "Sienna, who is this friend?" Sienna looked at the library shelves and thought about how to answer that. "Someone I met recently," she said. "He's not what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything," Jade said, which meant she was thinking several things. "Are you safe?" Sienna considered the question with more seriousness than Jade probably expected. "Yes," she said, and found that she meant it, and found also that meaning it required a particular trust she couldn't fully account for yet. "I'll explain when I can," she said. "Don't let Elliot know you've talked to me." After she hung up, she sat for a while with the phone in her lap and thought about safety as a thing you had to verify, as opposed to a thing that simply was. She had felt safe with Elliot for 2 years before she didn't. She had felt known and seen and chosen, and then, piece by piece, she had watched those feelings become the furniture of a house she could not change. Fixed in place, decorating a space that was no longer hers. Safety with Kaya Straven was a completely different animal. It was not comfortable and it was not warm, and it did not ask her to feel good about it. It simply was there, like the gate and the door that locked, and Rafe in the garage with his eyes on every exit. She was not sure yet if that was better or worse. She suspected it was more honest. The problem with Elliot's message was not what it said. The problem, Sienna was slowly realizing over the following days, was what it implied about what Elliot already knew. He knew where she was. Not approximately the roses had been delivered to a private residence that was not listed under any name she could find when she searched it. Not on any public record she could access. He had found the address in less than a week. She raised this with Caius on the 12th evening, standing in the kitchen after dinner while he washed a pan with the focused precision he applied to everything. And she said, "He found this address. In 9 days." How Caius set the pan on the drying rack and dried his hands and looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as the one he wore. When he had already answered this question privately and was deciding how much of the answer to give her, someone told him, he said, "Someone in this house, no. Flat. Absolute. Not defensive. Someone who knows you. Who knew to look here specifically?" She thought about that. She thought about her contacts, her colleagues, the mutual friends she and Elliot shared who might have seen her arrive here or been asked the right question by the right person. "He's resourceful," she said. And she said it with a feeling she didn't have a word for, not admiration, not affection, but the cold acknowledgement of a quality in someone that you had previously mistaken for something else. She had called it ambition. She had called it drive. She was starting to understand that the word she had been avoiding was control. "He's motivated," Caius said, and turned to put the pan away. And she stood there and felt the weight of the difference between those two words. She started going through her own things with more attention after that. Not obsessively, she had spent enough time in the territory of anxiety to know the difference between productive vigilance and spiraling, but carefully, methodically. The way she approached a new architectural brief: start with the foundations. Work upward. Don't assume the walls are where the blueprints say they are. She went through her laptop. She went through her professional email. She found nothing alarming, no planted software, nothing obviously duplicated. But she found, in the folder of documents she had shared with Elliot for the apartment lease, a copy of a letter she had written to her firm 3 months ago, requesting a professional reference. And in the metadata of that document, which had been accessed 2 weeks before she left him, was Elliot's login from a device she didn't recognize. Not his usual laptop, a different machine. He had been in her documents from somewhere else entirely. She sat with this information for a day before telling Caius, and when she did, he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And then he said, "Can I see it?" She showed him the metadata. He looked at it for a moment in a way that suggested it confirmed something rather than revealing something new. What she said. He said, "Later." She said, "You do that a lot. Say later." He looked at her. "I say it when the information needs context you don't have yet." "Who decides when I have enough context?" The question came out sharper than she intended. Sharpened by days of sleeping in someone else's house and running from a problem she had not chosen, and navigating information that kept arriving in pieces that were carefully managed, and she did not know yet by whose hand. He looked at her for a long moment, and the look was different from the calculation she had seen on the first night. There was something underneath it now, something that was not calculation at all, something she didn't have a name for, and that made her more unsettled than calculation ever had. "You do," he said. "When you ask, I'll tell you." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then tell me what you saw in the metadata." "A beat. To a server location," he said. "One I've seen before. Not connected to Elliot's firm. Connected to a different organization." He said it carefully, the way you said things when the words had more weight than they appeared. "Which organization?" He reached past her and closed her laptop gently. and the movement brought him close enough that she could smell the particular scent of him, cedar and something colder, like stone after rain, and he said, "The kind you don't want to be adjacent to." She let him close the laptop. She was angry about it. And she let herself be angry. And she was also beginning to understand that in this house, on this timeline, she was going to have to be patient with things she didn't like for reasons she couldn't yet see. It was the hardest thing he had asked of her, and he hadn't asked at all. On the 14th night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the room with the lock on the door and listened to the house, and at some point, after 1 in the morning, she got up and went into the hallway, and not really knowing where she was going, just needing to move inside the insomnia. The hall was dark except for the window at the far end where the North Shore streetlight cast a long rectangle on the floor. She walked toward it without really meaning to and stopped at the window and looked out at the grounds below the oak trees. The gate. In the darkness beyond. And that was when she realized Caius was there. Not at the window. At the door. The door at the end of the hall. The one that was always closed. He was standing in front of it with one hand braced against the doorframe and his head bowed slightly and his back to her. And she understood immediately that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. Not because he was doing anything he would be ashamed of, but because this was private in a way that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with loss. She stood very still. He didn't turn around. She did not know how long she stood there before she went back to her room. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who stood outside a closed door in the middle of the night and did not open it. And she thought that whatever was behind that door was something he had lost. Something that lived in the space between who he had been and who he had made himself into. And she thought that she understood that particular geography better than she wanted to. She didn't tell him she had seen him. He didn't tell her he had heard her in the hallway. She was beginning to understand. Two people who were very good at holding things in the dark without naming them. And this was either their most fundamental compatibility or the precise shape of the problem that was going to cost them both something later. On the morning of the 15th day, there was a delivery for her at the front gate. Not flowers this time. A box. Unmarked. Addressed to her full name. Rafe brought it in and set it on the kitchen island and stood back. And Caius came in from the study and looked at it. And the three of them looked at it together. And Caius said to Rafe, "Get the scanner." The scanner confirmed no electronics. No chemicals. Caius opened the box himself and inside was a single item, a photograph. The photograph was of Sienna and Caius taken through a long lens from across the street. On the day they had gone to the law office together. She was looking up at him from the sidewalk. He was looking out ahead of them with that particular vigilance. The photograph had been printed cleanly, which meant it had been taken with professional equipment and printed in haste, which meant it was a message, not a keepsake. On the back, in the same blue ink as the Rose's card, "I know who he is." "Do you?" She read it twice. She looked up at Caius. His face was entirely still. "Do I?" she said. He took the photograph from her hand very carefully and set it face down on the counter. "What part do you want to know first?" She thought about the room at the end of the hall and the phone call, with Vane's name in it, and the server location he had not named, and the 14 days of coffee and careful information, and the lock on the inside of her door, and the way he had once asked her what she drew when no one was watching. "The part that's relevant," she said, "to whatever's happening right now." He looked at her for a long moment that was different from any of the previous long moments. Something in it that was less calculation and more exposure. As if the photograph on the counter had moved something that had been fixed. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He did not sit. He stood across the island from her and he said, 3 years ago, my sister was killed." He said it without drama and without the careful management she had come to expect from him. And the lack of management was what made it hit her in the chest the way it did. Her name was Nadia. She was 23. She was killed because someone who was supposed to love her gave information about her location to people who wanted to use her to get to me. He stopped. She waited. The person who gave that information, he said, is someone you know well. She felt the floor of the world shift slightly under her. The specific vertigo of a truth arriving before you are ready for it. She already knew. In the way you knew things before you could say them out loud. She said it anyway. Elliot. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. The stillness of him in that moment was the most complete confirmation she had ever received for anything in her life. She sat with it. She sat with the weight of 3 years she had given to a man who had a death on his hands that he had never told her about. And she sat with the weight of 2 weeks in this house with a man who had known it from the moment she said the name and had not told her either. And the dual weight of those 2 silences was extraordinary, like holding 2 stones of the same size and finding they had completely different temperatures. You knew, she said, that first night, when I said his name. Yes. And you didn't tell me? No. She looked down at the counter and then back up at him. Why, he looked at her with something that was not the calculation she had categorized him by, and not the exposure of a moment ago, but something that was both of those things at once. Layered, genuine, and careful in a way that was different from his usual carefulness. Careful the way people are, careful with things that matter to them. Because you wouldn't have believed me, he said. You had just left him. You were angry and raw, and I was a stranger who had no reason to be on your side. If I had told you that the man you just left was responsible for my sister's death, you would have heard it as a threat. Or a lie. Or both. She wanted to argue with this. She thought about arguing with it. She thought about the kitchen on the first morning and the way she had reached for every reason to leave, and she thought about who she had been 14 days ago. And she knew he was right. She also knew that right did not make it comfortable. And now, she said, now you've been here long enough to know whether I'm dangerous to you. He said, are you? She met his eyes. I haven't decided yet, she said, which was the truest thing she had said in 2 weeks. He took that with the same steadiness. He took everything. And she thought she saw the faintest thing move through his expression, not relief. Exactly. But something adjacent to it. The specific quality of a man who had expected to be condemned and had received something complicated instead. There's more, he said. When you're ready. Tomorrow, she said. She stood up from the stool and left the kitchen and went upstairs. And she did not lock the door that night. And she did not examine why. She found out about the flowers card 2 days later that Elliot had sent it not to upset her, which was what she had assumed, but to test the mail system of the house, to see how fast an outside package could reach the interior. He had found out it could in under 2 hours, which meant he had been mapping logistics, not making gestures. Caius told her this the way he told her most things, concisely, without embellishment, watching her face as he did to see how she was landing. She received it the way she was learning to receive information in this house, whole and still, without letting herself react until she had turned it over enough to understand which part of it scared her most. The part that scared her most was not that Elliot was dangerous. She had been arriving at that conclusion for days. The part that scared her most was that she had given him 3 years of access to her schedule, her habits, her finance, her vulnerabilities, her location, and she had given it willingly, trustingly, under the flag of love. And now that access was a weapon she had helped build. What does he want? She asked. He needs something he thinks you have access to, Caius said. Or he needs you as a variable he can control. Possibly both. She thought about that. She thought about the photograph on the back of the card. I know who he is. Do you? It was designed to make her doubt Caius, to push her back toward Elliot, to create a gap that Elliot could walk through. She thought about how well she had known Elliot, and how wrong she had been. And she thought about how little she knew Kaya Elder and how right her instincts had been in this house, even when she didn't have the crass words for them. And she thought that perhaps she had been using the wrong metric for trust for a very long time. That evening, Caius cooked again, something with fish this time. Lemon and capers. Simple and exact. And they sat across from each other and she said, "Tell me about Nadia." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the decision move across his face whether to give her the protected version or the real one. He gave her the real one. Nadia had been his younger sister by 6 years. The person who had kept him tethered to the version of himself that was not purely the Draven heir and everything that came with that name. She had been studying architecture. Sienna felt that land in her chest with particular weight and said nothing. She had wanted to leave Chicago. Nadia had, and Caius had been arranging it, had been putting pieces in place for her to go to school in Paris when Elliot Vane, who had been dating Nadia for 4 months under a name she didn't know was false, gave her location on a specific night to a faction of the Rivera organization that had a score to settle with the Draven name. Caius got there an hour too late. He talked about it the way people talked about the thing that had reorganized their entire internal landscape factually. Precisely. And with a particular flatness in the voice that was the sound of a grief that had been lived with long enough to become structural. He did not cry. He did not look away. He told her, and then he stopped talking, and they sat together in the specific silence of a story that was over and not over at the same time. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were not enough, and she knew it, and she said them anyway because sometimes the insufficiency of words was itself the right response. He looked at her across the table, and for the first time since she had come to this house, she saw him without the readiness, without the architecture that governed his face at all, other times just a man sitting with an unbridgeable loss, and it was perhaps the most human thing she had seen in years. "She would have liked you," he said. It was the last thing either of them said for the rest of the evening, and it sat between them all the way through the clearing of the table and the washing of dishes and the small, ordinary business of 2 people existing in the same space, carrying it the way you carried things that were too important to put down. The next morning, Sienna woke to a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Your friend Jade called someone she shouldn't have. You have 48 hours to come home." Then the word home was crossed out and replaced. "Then this stops being a conversation." She showed it to Caius without saying anything. He read it twice. He said, "I need to make some calls." She said, "I'm calling Jade first." He said, "Together." Then, it was the first time he had used that word. Together, as if it were a natural and agreed-upon thing, and neither of them remarked on it. But she noticed it. She added it to the list she was keeping in her notes app. The list of things she didn't yet know how to categorize. And she looked at the growing length of that list and thought that she was either building a case for something or building a way out of something. And she still could not tell which. The call to Jade lasted 22 minutes. Sienna sat at the kitchen island and Caius stood to her right, just outside the frame of a conversation that was hers, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to give her the space to handle it herself. Jade had not called anyone deliberately harmful. She had mentioned to a colleague at the firm that Sienna was staying with a friend and doing fine. And that colleague, as it turned out, had a connection through a mutual acquaintance to someone in Elliot's orbit. A 2-step chain. Nothing malicious from Jade's end, but enough. Sienna talked Jade through what she needed to do. New number. No more mentions of Sienna's name to anyone at work. A week of vacation if she could manage it, and Jade, to her credit, asked no questions she wasn't supposed to ask and wrote down everything Sienna told her to write down. When she hung up, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the counter, and Caius reached past her and set a glass of water on the counter to her left. Not in front of her. And she picked it up and drank half of it and said, "She's fine." She didn't know. "I know," he said. How she said. Because if Elliot had someone competent watching her, he wouldn't have needed to send you a text. He'd have used her differently. She turned the glass in her hands. "You know how he thinks." It was not a question. "I've been studying how he operates for 2 years," Caius said, with the particular flatness in his voice that meant the subject had edges she hadn't found yet. "Since Nadia." "Yes." She set the glass down. She looked at the counter for a moment and then up at him. "And in 2 years, you didn't." She stopped. Started again. "You had enough to, couldn't you have?" No, he said, before she finished. Not without evidence that would stand, and not without risk to you or someone else he was close to. He's careful. He makes himself look like collateral damage, not like the source. She nodded slowly, and the nod was not agreement so much as the accommodation of a complexity she was still growing large enough to hold. Elliot Vane, who had cooked Sunday dinners and remembered the name of her high school best friend and picked her up from the airport at 6 in the morning, had also sold a young woman's location to people who intended to kill her, and had done it carefully enough that 2 years of effort by a man with considerable resources had not been enough to prove it. She thought about the careful man versus the Sunday dinner man, and she thought these were not two people but one person, and that she had been intimate with the Sunday dinner man for 3 years. And the feeling this produced in her chest was something she was going to have to put somewhere eventually. But not today. Rafe brought news on the 17th morning. The day Sienna's suitcase had been in the left room for exactly 2.5 weeks, Elliot had secured legal representation specifically focused on domestic disappearance cases. The attorney had already contacted Sienna's firm asking about her last known location. He was building a paper record that could be used in a civil proceeding, establishing a pattern of her absence that would serve a purpose. Caius explained quietly, and without alarm, if Elliot could demonstrate that Sienna had voluntarily isolated herself with a known figure from organized crime, he could preemptively discredit anything she might say about him. Not to put her in danger, the danger was incidental. To protect himself. To build a wall of plausible narrative around whatever he was protecting. She listened to all of this and said, "I need to go back to work." Caius looked at her. "Not yet. I'm not asking permission," she said. It came out cleaner and steadier than she expected, and she saw something move behind his expression, a reassessment. Quick and quiet. "No," he agreed. "You're not. I'm advising. You going to the office gives him a location, a schedule, and people around you who don't know what you're in the middle of. If you want to go back, we do it on your terms. With structure." She thought about this. She thought about her terms, specifically, and what they looked like in a situation she had not chosen and could not yet see the full shape of. "What kind of structure?" she said. He told her. It was thorough and not comfortable, and it required her to trust more than she currently felt like trusting. She looked at him across the kitchen, and she thought about the room at the end of the hall and what was behind it. And she thought about the name he had said in the phone call. Wait. And she thought about the flowers and the photograph and the 48 hours and Nadia studying architecture in a version of the world that no longer existed. "Okay," she said. He looked slightly surprised by the speed of it, which was the first time she had seen him surprised by anything she did. And she decided she liked that the small, specific power of being unpredictable to someone who had thought he had her mapped. "Okay," he said, and turned to talk to Rafe. And she refilled her coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the oak trees in November gray and thought that she had come here with a suitcase and a breakup text and nowhere to go. And whatever she was in the middle of now. It was not nothing. It was not the hotel room. It was not Elliot's apology face and the silence underneath his words. It was complicated and dangerous and full of information she didn't have yet. And she was in it with a man who stood outside closed doors in the night and remembered things she said about buildings and had once said she would like someone who was gone. She was not sure what to do with any of that. She was sure, at least, that she was not going to do what Elliot expected. That, for now, was enough. That evening, the last of the nights she would spend in this house before everything accelerated. Caius did something he hadn't done before. He came to the library after dinner not to pass through but to stay, and he sat in the chair by the window, her chair. The one she had claimed without asking permission, and she sat on the window seat across from it with her knees pulled to her chest. And he picked up the Cortázar she had left, marked on the table, and opened it to her page and said, "Read me the last paragraph you got to." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Not challenging. Just waiting. She reached across and took the book from him and read the paragraph aloud. And the words in the quiet library were different from the words on the page. They had texture and breadth and weight that they didn't have when she read them to herself. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. And then he said, he wrote that in a hotel room in Buenos Aires. He had been in exile for years. She looked at the paragraph again. It reads like someone who can't go home. She said, yes. Caius said. He was looking out the window at the dark grounds below. It does. The two of them sat there together in the quiet, with the book between them and the dark outside, and all the things they were not yet saying filling the room the way heat fills a room. Gradually, thoroughly, until the air itself felt different, and there was no going back to the temperature it had been before. The invitation came on a Thursday. Though invitation was perhaps too gentle a word for what it was. Caius came to find her in the library at 3 p.m. and stood in the doorway. And from the quality of his stillness, she had learned to read as the particular stillness of someone delivering news they had already decided how to deliver. And he said, the Draven Foundation hosts an annual event Friday evening. A benefit. I need to attend. She looked up from the book. You need me there. Elliot will be there, he said. Someone invited him. That doesn't happen accidentally. She closed the book. You think he's going to try to approach me in public? I think he's going to try to approach you somewhere I can't respond without creating a scene that he can use later. Caius said. He's precise about choosing his terrain. Public events. Witnesses. Controlled environments where my response options are limited. She thought about that. She thought about Elliot at the charity auction the previous spring. The way he had worked a room. The particular charm of him in a crowd. How he made each person feel singularly known. She had admired it then. She understood it differently now. If I'm not there, then he finds another way. Caius said. And the next terrain he chooses will be one where you have less information than tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not asking me to go, she said. No, he agreed. I'm laying out the situation and leaving the decision to you. That's a form of asking. It's a form of respecting, he said, with a directness that landed differently than she expected, catching her off guard the way things in this house occasionally did when she thought she had the measure of them. She nodded. What time? The Draven Foundation event was held in a hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of space that had been designed to make wealth feel inevitable, high ceilings, chandeliers that cost more than the charity would receive, tables dressed in ivory with the careful precision of people who understood that the environment was the first argument. Caius had arranged for a car and she had returned to her room without comment. A garnet-colored dress hanging on the back of her door that afternoon. Her size exactly, with shoes that matched. She had stood looking at it for a long moment before putting it on, understanding that it was not a gift, it was logistics. The same category as the locked door and the scanner and Rafe's eyes on every exit but finding, to her slight frustration, that the dress fit so well, it was difficult to resent. She came downstairs and found Caius in the foyer, in a black suit that had the particular quality of being exactly right without effort. And he looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not the calculation, and not the readiness, and not the exposure from the kitchen with Nadia's name between them. But something that he put away before she could name it. The car's outside, he said. She followed him out. In the car, she asked, What's my role tonight? He was looking out the window. The city moving past them in streams of light. The bridge over the river, and then the magnificent mile, and the particular compression of downtown Chicago at night. Yourself, he said. That's the strongest position you can be in when someone is trying to reframe you. She thought about this. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been at Elliot's events, strategic, careful, calibrated to what the room needed from her. She thought about the version of herself that existed in the library with the Cortázar and at the kitchen window in the mornings, and asking Caius questions he was not prepared to be asked. What if Elliot approaches me directly? Let him, Caius said. If you walk away immediately, he can frame it. If you engage, you can control what he gets from the conversation. He paused. Don't give him anything real. Give him the version of you that's uncertain, frightened. It's what he expects, and it will keep him from adjusting his approach. She looked at the city going past. You want me to perform. I want you to be strategic, he said, with the distinction in his voice that said the difference mattered to him. There's a difference between performing a version of yourself for someone who wants to use that version and performing a version of yourself for someone who wants to know you. She turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window. She thought that was perhaps the most he had given her of himself outside of the kitchen with Nadia's story between them. That distinction and the weight he had put on the word no, and she sat with it all the way through the rest of the drive. The room was full when they arrived. 300 people arranged in the particular social geometry of wealth and obligation, and she felt the room register Caius's entrance, the way a room registered a change in atmospheric pressure, a collective small adjustment, a tightening and refocusing, conversations pausing and resuming in new directions. She stayed at his side for the first 40 minutes because it was the position that gave her the most information, watching who approached him and how, watching who watched him from a distance, watching the room orient itself around him as rooms in this world apparently did. He introduced her twice, briefly, without title or context, just her name. And she had the specific experience of having her own name presented as sufficient and found it striking. She had spent 3 years having Elliot introduce her as his girlfriend, his partner, his Sienna, a possessive that had once felt like love and now felt like what it had always been. Caius said her name and moved on and let her be what she was in the space beside him. She saw Elliot before he saw her. He was across the room near the bar. In a suit she recognized charcoal, slim cut, the one he wore to things that mattered to him, and he was in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize. Both of them in the particular way of men who were listening to Elliot more carefully than the conversation seemed to require. She watched him for a moment. He looked, as he always looked in these settings, entirely comfortable, as though the world had been arranged to his specifications, and he was simply moving through it. Then his head turned, a small quarter pivot, and he found her across the room with the ease of someone who already knew exactly where to look. He excused himself from the 2 men and moved toward her, and she watched him cross the room and thought of something Caius had said in the car and put it on like a coat. Let him come. Sienna. He stopped 3 feet from her with the apology face, but refined, now less practiced, more genuine seeming, as though the weeks had improved the performance. You look beautiful, Elliot, she said. Neutral. Nothing to grab onto. Can we talk, he said. In private. We're talking now, she said. He glanced at the people nearest to them. Not here. Please. 5 minutes. His voice was pitched low and carried a tremor she recognized as the one he deployed when he wanted her to feel that she had the power in the exchange, that she was the one with the choice to offer mercy. She had once mistaken this quality for vulnerability. Now she saw it as the instrument it was. Precise and well-maintained. 5 minutes, she said. She told herself it was strategic. She told herself it was information gathering. Exactly what Caius had said: engage. Control. Give him the version of herself that doesn't adjust his approach. They moved to a quieter corner near the windows, overlooking Michigan Avenue from 9 floors up, and she stood with the view at her back and watched him arrange his face into sincerity. I know this looks bad, Elliot said. The accounts. The report. I panicked. I know that's not an excuse. I didn't know what else to do. You froze my accounts, she said. To protect you, he said. From him. Draven. Sienna. Do you know what that man is? I know who he is, she said. I don't think you do, Elliot said, with the particular softness of someone who is about to give you terrible news for your own good. He's not someone you can trust. Whatever he's told you, whatever version of himself he's shown you, it's a construction. He uses people. He's used women before. She listened to the words, and she listened to the space around the words, what he was building, which wall he was trying to move, which door he was trying to close. "Why are you here tonight?" she said. He looked at her as if the question surprised him. "Because you're here. Because I needed to see you. Because I have something I need to." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture she remembered used to make her feel tender and now made her feel nothing. "I need you to come home," he said. "I need 48 hours. I need you somewhere safe while I sort something out. And then I'm gone. Out of your life. I promise you." She looked at him. The city behind him through the window was beautiful and indifferent. The way cities always were from high up. Everything looking organized and purposeful when you couldn't see the people in it. She knew it was a trap. She understood it with a clarity that 3 years ago she would not have had, and she understood that the clarity was not entirely her own. It had been built, carefully, in a library and a kitchen, and 17 days of arriving at the same conclusion from different angles. She also understood that Elliot was, in this moment, frightened in a way he had not been in the kitchen with the apology face, and that his fear was not about her, and not about Caius, and not about whatever story he was telling her now. His fear was about something else entirely, something she could feel in the specific quality of his urgency, the way a ship feels a current before it can see the rocks. He needed her for a reason that was not about love or loss, or even manipulation for its own sake. He needed her for a purpose. "What are you sorting out?" she said. He hesitated, which was the most honest thing he had done in the conversation. "Something that went sideways," he said. "Something I need to close out." Before he stopped again, before what he looked at her, and for a moment she saw something she had not seen in 3 years, Elliot Vane without his performance. Just the man underneath it, who was afraid and calculating and capable of things she was still coming to terms with. "Before it closes me out first," he said. She let the silence sit for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. His shoulders dropped a fraction relief, premature and revealing. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it. Come by the old place tomorrow." I said I'd think about it," she said. "I didn't say tomorrow." He nodded. He knew better than to push. He touched her arm briefly, just the inside of her wrist. And the touch had nothing of possessiveness in it, only the particular desperation of someone reaching for what they used to have. She waited until he had moved away, and then she turned to the window and looked at the city below and took 3 slow breaths. Caius was at her side within a minute of her turning back to the room. Not rushing, not dramatic, just present, the way he had a quality of appearing in her vicinity without requiring notice. He did not ask what Elliot had said. He looked at her face and said, "Tell me, Lotter, are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I need to make a decision." He looked at her for a moment. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you eat something and talk to people who have nothing to do with this. Tomorrow," she considered arguing. She was tired and full of information and the specific adrenaline of having held a conversation with a man she now understood as genuinely dangerous while performing the version of herself she had been asked to perform. She found, when she reached for the argument, that it wasn't there. "Fine," she said. He steered her gently, one hand at the small of her back for exactly the duration of crossing the room, toward a table where an older woman was holding court over a small group who were laughing at something she had said. "Greta Halvorsen," he said quietly. "She funded the original pediatric wing at Northwestern. She'll talk to you about architecture for as long as you can stand it." It was such a specific and considerate thing to do to find her. In this room full of strangers and tension, someone she would actually want to talk to, that she was caught off guard by it, by the evidence of attention it required, and she was still caught off guard when Greta Halvorsen turned to her with the excellent radar of a woman who had been navigating rooms like this for 60 years and said, "You look like someone who's had enough of this party. Tell me something interesting." Sienna looked at her and thought that honesty was sometimes the most strategic position. "I've been sketching buildings for 5 years that no one has ever seen. she said. "I'd love to know what you think about the new tower they're putting up on Wacker." Greta Halverson's eyes lit up like a woman finding someone worth talking to, and for the next 2 hours, Sienna forgot. Almost. About Elliot and the window and the thing that had gone sideways. On the drive home, she told Caius everything, every word of the conversation. The way he had touched her wrist. The fear she had felt underneath the performance. The phrase "before it closes me out first." She told it in sequence, precisely. And he listened the entire time without interrupting. Which she had come to understand was one of the things about him that was distinct. He listened the way people listened when they were building something with what they heard, not just waiting for their turn. When she finished, the car was pulling onto the North Shore Road, and he said, "He's being pressured by someone above him in the Rivera organization. The operation he's been part of is incomplete, and they need something from him to close it out." She looked at him, "And he thinks I can help him get it, or he thinks you are it." Caius said, "The thing they need is access to internal Draven organizational information. Elliot doesn't have it, but someone close to me might be assumed to." She let that land. "He's going to try to use me as leverage with Rivera," she said. "Against you. That would be the most efficient play," Caius said. With the particular flatness that meant he had already gamed this scenario, and she was now catching up to him. She stared at the dark road ahead. "He told me to come to the old apartment," she said. "Tomorrow." She felt Caius go very still beside her. The specific stillness she had catalogued on the first night. The stone dropped into deep water. No ripple. "You told him you'd think about it," Caius said. "Yes." "Are you?" She looked at him. He was looking forward, jaw set, and there was something in his profile that was not the calculation and not the readiness, but something older and harder. A man who had seen exactly this situation once before and had arrived an hour late and had spent 2 years living in the geometry of what an hour late meant. "I need to know what he's protecting," she said. "I need to know what went sideways. If he's in contact with Rivera, there's evidence somewhere, something concrete, something that doesn't rely on anyone's word against anyone else's." Caius turned and looked at her then, and the look was extraordinary in its complexity, assessment, and concern, and something protective that had nothing to do with the gate or the locked room, and everything to do with the man she had seen standing in the prize hallway at 1 a.m. "Sienna," he said, "you're thinking about going there." "I'm thinking about what information I could get," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment. "They're not. In this case," he said. She looked back at him without flinching. "Then talk me out of it," she said. He was quiet for the rest of the drive. He did not talk her out of it. She understood. Lying in bed that night with the decision already made, even though she had not yet said so, that his silence was not agreement. It was the recognition of a person who had made up their mind. And the respect, unwilling and worried and genuine, that the recognition required. She set an alarm for 7 the next morning and stared at the ceiling and told herself she would call him when she was there. She did not quite believe herself. She left at 8:30 in the morning, before Caius came downstairs. She left a note on the kitchen counter, 3 words. "I'll call you," and she carried her coat and her phone and the specific weight of a decision she had made with her eyes open, which was different from the decisions she had been making for the last 3 years. And she got into a rideshare she had booked under Jade's account to avoid the flag. And she rode toward the neighborhood she had lived in for 2 years. Toward the apartment that still had her name on the lease and Elliot Vane's presence threaded through every corner of it. And she sat in the back of the car and made herself think clearly about what she needed and how to get it. She was not going to confront Elliot. She was going to observe. She had texted him from the car. An hour before leaving, "I'll come by at 10. She wanted him prepared, presenting, settled into the version of the conversation he planned to have, because a prepared Elliot was a predictable Elliot. And predictable was what she needed him to be. The apartment building looked the same as it always had: red brick. 6 stories. The kind of building that had been repainted twice in the last decade and was better for it. The lobby still smelled like the cleaning product the super used on Thursdays. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and stood in the hallway for a moment before she knocked. And the moment she knocked, she heard 2 voices inside Elliot's and someone else's. Lower, more clipped, with the specific rhythm of someone who was not comfortable in a residential setting, someone accustomed to spaces with more exits. The voices stopped. A pause. Then Elliot's footsteps. Too quick. And the sound of another door, the bedroom, the one connected to the fire escape. And then Elliot opened the front door with the apology face and a quality of controlled urgency underneath it that he had not entirely managed to hide. "You're early," he said. "You said 10. It's 5 past." She said. He let her in. The apartment had been reorganized since she left her things gone, obviously, but also rearranged in a way that suggested habitual use by more than one person. A quality in how objects were positioned that said someone else had been moving through this space, opening these cabinets, sitting in this chair. She stood in the living room and let her eyes move through the space in the way Rafe had taught her to move her eyes through a garage pattern breaks. Things in places they had not been before. The coffee table had a tablet on it she didn't recognize. The kitchen counter had 2 coffee cups, both used. One still warm enough to steam slightly. Near the kitchen, half visible behind the counter, it was a briefcase that was not the one Elliot usually carried. It was harder. Square. The kind of case that had a combination lock rather than a clasp. "Who was here?" she said. "No one," Elliot said. "I had a call." With 2 coffee cups, he looked at the counter and then at her and made a decision she could see him making. The calculation of whether to continue the lie or to move to a different truth. He moved to a different truth. "A colleague," he said. "From the firm, on a Saturday morning," she said. "There's a case. It's complicated." She nodded as if she believed this and moved to the living room and sat on the couch in the position that let her see the kitchen and the hallway and the bedroom door. And she said, "Tell me what you need me to do." He sat across from her and he told her the version he had prepared, smaller and neater than the truth. Fitted to what he thought she needed to hear. He needed 48 hours. He needed her to stay in the apartment where he could confirm she was safe. Not with Draven. He needed her to sign a document, nothing alarming. He said. A statement that she had been residing at this address for the past 3 weeks. She listened to the entire thing. She watched his face as he spoke and she watched the bedroom door, which was closed. And she thought about the second coffee cup and the briefcase with the combination lock and the 2 voices she had heard through the door. "What's in the briefcase?" she said. He blinked. "What briefcase?" "The one behind your kitchen counter." She watched the small failure of his composure a flicker. 3 seconds. Precisely like the 3 seconds that had crossed Caius's face on the first night, but with a completely different quality. Nothing cold and decided here. Only the chaotic reshuffling of someone whose plan had a gap in it. He said, "Work materials. Sienna." "It's not. Can I see it?" He stood up. "It's not relevant. This is about us. About getting you somewhere safe. You said you'd be gone," she said. "After 48 hours. Gone from my life. But what you're actually describing is me staying here while you finish something." "What are you finishing?" He crossed to the kitchen and she followed. Because she had learned, in 17 days in a house with a man who never said more than was necessary, to move toward information when it moved, not to wait for it to come to her. He was between her and the briefcase now, and his face had lost most of the apology structure, replaced by something more stripped, more direct, and she thought this was probably the truest version of Elliot Vane she had ever seen. "Go home," he said. "Go back to Draven's house. I'll send you something that proves everything I've said, that he can't be trusted, that he's using you. Give me 48 hours and you'll have the proof." She looked at him and thought that the proof she needed was not what he thought it was. She looked past him at the briefcase with its combination lock, and she looked at the bedroom door that was still closed. and she looked at the second coffee cup still steaming. And she pulled out her phone as though checking a message and angled it slightly and took 4 photographs of the briefcase, the cups, the tablet on the coffee table, and then slid the phone back into her pocket. "I'll think about it," she said. For the second time in 12 hours. She said it with the same neutrality she had used the night before. And she watched him receive it the same way with the premature relief of a man who heard what he needed to hear. She turned toward the door. "Sienna." She stopped. "Don't go back to him," Elliot said. She heard something in his voice she had not expected, not desperation, not the manipulative tremor, but something genuine and frightened that was, she thought, real, though it was real for reasons that had nothing to do with her. "I'm not saying this for me. I'm saying this because that house is about to become very dangerous, and I need you not to be in it." She stood with her back to him for a moment. "Why is it about to become dangerous?" Silence. She turned around. He was looking at her with the fear showing through in a way that had cost him something to let her see. "Because people are coming for what he has," Elliot said, quietly, "and they don't care what's in the way." She held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she said, "Goodbye, Elliot," and walked out the door. She was at the elevator before her hands started shaking, and she let them shake because she was alone and there was no one to perform for. And she pressed the button and stood in the hallway and thought about people coming for what he has, and the bedroom door still closed and the second cup still warm. And she opened her phone and looked at the 4 photographs she had taken and enlarged the one of the briefcase. On the side of it, printed in small letters she had not been close enough to see in the apartment, was a company name, Rivera Logistics and Holdings. She stood in the elevator hallway for 10 seconds, and then she opened her contacts and called Caius. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me you're outside," he said. "I'm in the hallway," she said. "I'm coming out. Rafe is across the street," he said. "I need you to walk straight to him. Don't take your phone out of your pocket." "I already have it out," she said. "I have photographs." Pause. 1 beat. 2. "Get to Rafe," Caius said, and his voice was level, but there was something underneath the level, something that had been compressed into the words, the way pressure was compressed into small containers. "We'll talk when you're in the car." She got to Rafe. She got in the car, and it was only when the car was moving and the apartment building was behind her and the November lake was visible at the Tybal end of the cross street that she realized Caius had not asked her what the photographs were of, which meant he had already known she would come here, and he had already known she would find something. And the shape of that knowledge was the shape of the next conversation, and she was not ready to have it. She looked at the photographs the whole ride back. The briefcase was the clearest, the lettering unmistakable once she'd zoomed in. Rivera Logistics and Holdings in corporate sans serif. The kind of name that was designed to look mundane and function as cover. The tablet on the coffee table showed what appeared to be a spreadsheet in the reflected glare of the window, numbers and what might have been coordinates, though she couldn't read the specifics from the angle. The coffee cup nearest the kitchen, the second one. The guests had a print on the handle, a distinct ring where someone had gripped it hard, and she thought about the voice she had heard before the bedroom door closed, lower and more clipped than Elliot's, the voice of someone who visited but did not live there, who had brought a briefcase and a schedule and left through the fire escape rather than the front door. She thought about Elliot's face when she asked about the briefcase. She thought about people coming for what he has. She thought about the version of Caius Draven that Elliot had been building for weeks in the periphery of her attention, dangerous, using her, constructed, and she thought about the version of Caius she had built in 17 days in a library and a kitchen and a hallway at 1 a.m. And she thought that she had never been more certain in her life about which version was accurate. And she had also never in her life been in a position that required her to be more right. The car pulled into the North Shore driveway and Rafe parked and opened her door and she walked into the house. And Caius was in the foyer. Not in the study or the kitchen. Not on his phone in the foyer. Standing, waiting, And the fact that he was standing in the foyer at 10:45 in the morning, having clearly not moved from that spot since she left, was the kind of information that arrived sideways and landed in her chest and stayed there. She showed him the photographs. He looked at the one of the briefcase for exactly 3 seconds, and then he looked up at her and said, "Was there someone else there? Bedroom door? Didn't see a face. Heard a voice before he came to let me in. Lower register. Clipped. Left through the fire escape." He nodded slowly. "Processing and building simultaneously. Rivera personnel," he said. "They're using Elliot's apartment as a transfer point. Probably been using it for months." She thought about months. She thought about all the evenings she had spent in that apartment with Elliot while a briefcase full of someone else's logistics sat somewhere in the same building. Or around the corner. Or already transferred. She thought about how close she had been to the edge of something without knowing the edge existed. "He's trying to get out," she said. "Whatever he got into with Rivera, he's trying to close it and exit." "Yes," Caius said. "And they're not letting him. What does he have that they need?" Caius looked at her for a long moment. "Access," he said. "Not to me. To the Draven Financial Network. He's been embedded for 2 years. He has routing information, account structures. Nothing he can act on directly. I changed those protocols after Nadia, but enough that the Rivera organization can use it to do things I can't immediately trace back to them. He's been feeding it in pieces, paying down whatever debt he owes them." She received this. She sat with all of it. The weight of it. The architecture of a scheme that had been running while she made Sunday dinners and went to charity auctions and believed she was in a relationship with a person when she was in proximity to an operation. "He told me the house was about to become dangerous," she said. "That people were coming for what you have. They're already here," Caius said, with the particular flatness that meant this was not new information to him. "They have been since before you arrived. My arriving at that particular phone number was not entirely an accident." She went very still. "You mean your number was in a directory that Elliot had access to?" he said. "It was the cleanest way to get someone I could trust into a position adjacent to him without him understanding what I was doing." The silence in the foyer was absolute. She looked at him and she felt the entire structure of the last 17 days shift slightly under its own weight. The way a building shifts when you remove a load-bearing assumption and find the space where the truth was always going to be. "You were waiting for him to make contact with me," she said. "Not quite," Caius said. "I was watching the number. When it rang, I answered. What you did after that was your choice." She held his gaze. "But you knew who I was. Before the first night." He was quiet. The silence was its own answer, and she thought she had been right. That night, in the library with the Cortazar, that this house ran on a particular order of information and that she had not yet learned to read it entirely. She had not been wrong that she was safe here. She had not been wrong that Caius was something different from what she had been told he was. But the story she had told herself about the wrong number and the arbitrary connection and the accident of arrival was not the whole story. And standing in the foyer with the photographs in her hand and the lake somewhere beyond the trees and the November cold coming through the old walls of this house, she understood that there was a version of being right about the important things that did not protect you from the specific grief of learning. You had been a variable in someone else's calculation. She said, "I need some time." "Yes," he said. She went upstairs. She did not lock the door. She sat in the window of her room and looked at the oak trees and thought that the thing she needed to decide was not whether she could trust him. She already knew the answer to that. And the answer had not changed, but whether the particular shape of the trust she had built, the one that had started to feel like something she chose rather than something that was constructed for her, could hold the weight of what she now knew. She did not know yet. She looked at the oak trees until the light changed, and then she looked at the photographs again. And somewhere in the space between looking at the photographs and looking at the trees, she understood what she needed to do next. and that she was going to have to do most of it alone. She went to her room and stayed there for 4 hours. And in those 4 hours, she did several things in a specific order that she did not tell anyone about. The first thing she did was call her lawyer, not about the lease, not about the frozen accounts, which had long since been resolved, but about a specific kind of document preparation. The kind that would allow information to be transmitted to a designated recipient on a delay unless a contact instruction was canceled. Her lawyer listened without apparent surprise. He was the kind of lawyer, she had learned, who did not surprise easily, and told her it could be arranged by end of business Monday. The second thing she did was look up Elliot's smartwatch. They had shared a family account for Apple devices because it was cheaper and because she had been that kind of trusting, and the account was still active in her name because she had not thought to close it. And the watch GPS put him at the apartment building with no displacement since she had left, which meant the Rivera contact. He had left through the fire escape and Elliot had stayed, which meant the briefcase had either left with the contact or was still in the apartment. And she needed to know which. The third thing she did was open the settings on her own smartwatch, the one she had worn to the charity benefit, the one she wore every day. A slim silver band that Jade had given her for her birthday, and she confirmed that it had video recording capability that saved locally to the watch's internal storage before syncing. She sat with this information for a while. Then she went downstairs. Caius was in the study, which was the room she had never entered and never been explicitly invited into. The door was open for the first time, which she understood was not an accident. She stood in the doorway and he was at the desk with his back to her, a phone to his ear, and he said something she couldn't hear and ended the call and turned around. The study was lined with bookshelves, like the library but more functional papers, folders, a whiteboard with names and connections drawn in dry erase that someone had partially erased, the ghost of a diagram still visible in the residue. On the corner of the desk was a framed photograph, the only personal object in the room, a young woman with Caius's bone structure and an expression that was all her own. Open and curious, and entirely unguarded in the way that people who have not yet learned to guard themselves were. Sienna looked at the photograph and understood without being told. "Nadia," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the photograph for a moment longer, the young woman studying architecture, the world that had been arranged against her. And then she looked at Caius and said, "I'm not going to stay angry at you." He was quiet. "I want to," she said. "I think I'm entitled to. But I'm going to have to do something in the next 24 hours that I can't do angry, and I need you to tell me everything you didn't tell me before. All of it. Right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He stood across the desk and told her everything. He had known Elliot Vane's name before Sienna ever came through his gate. He had known it for 22 months. In the specific way you knew the name of the person responsible for the thing that reorganized your entire life precisely, constantly, in the way a compass always knew north. He had been building a case, slowly, through channels that were not available in a courtroom, compiling evidence that was solid enough to be useful but requiring a final piece that he hadn't been able to reach. Confirmation of Elliot's active operational relationship with Rivera Logistics that was documented and current, not historical. Historical could be disputed. Current could not. The problem was, access Elliot's relationship with Rivera was compartmentalized even within Rivera's own organization, conducted through a small team and documented in materials that moved between locations. The routing number Elliot had used to transmit financial information from the Draven network had been traced to a holding company that dissolved and reformed under a new name every 6 months. The server location Sienna had found in the document metadata led to a physical address that was clean when anyone went to look. Elliot was careful. He had been careful for 2 years. And then he had met Sienna. And through Sienna, because Elliot was careful about his work but less careful about his personal life than he believed, he had become visible, not to Caius at first, to a contact of Caius's in the FBI's Organized Crime Division, who flagged the name Elliot Vane in connection with a separate Rivera investigation and cross-referenced it to a file that already had Nadia Draven in it. The file came to Caius 3 months before Sienna had sent the wrong text. He had begun watching. Not Sienna specifically, he had not known her name at that point, but the number in the directory that served as Elliot's personal relay for Rivera contacts. That number happened to be listed 2 entries above Jade Chen in a contacts export that had been shared through a server Caius's people monitored. When a text arrived from an unknown number, a breakup text, 42 words, ending in, "Don't call me Caius," read it, and understood 3 things simultaneously: that the woman texting did not know who she was texting, that she was leaving Elliot Vane, and that Elliot Vane was going to need to find her once he understood she had left, which meant she was about to become a variable in an operation Caius needed to observe without disrupting. He answered. He offered the address. He made the calculation that a woman leaving a dangerous man would be safer in a house he controlled than in a hotel that Elliot could access, and that her presence gave him an observation point that was cleaner than surveillance from a distance. He had been right about all of this. He had also, he told her, without softening it, not anticipated that the calculation would become something else. That the woman with the wrong number would have opinions about Cortázar and buildings no one had seen, and would ask him about the room at the end of the hall and sit in his library past midnight, and gradually make the house feel like it contained something other than grief and infrastructure. He did not say this the way someone said a thing that was designed to change how she felt about the information that preceded it. He said it the way someone said a thing that was true and had become unavoidable, and that he was not going to offer as a justification, but also was not going to withhold as a fact. She sat across the desk from him and listened to all of it and was quiet for a while. "The final piece of evidence you need," she said. "It's in that briefcase." He nodded. Rivera's transfer documentation. It would have routing numbers, transaction records, the communication chain between Elliot and their operations team. Everything I've been missing. "He's going to move it," she said. "As soon as he figures out I found it." "Yes," Caius said. "By tonight. Probably. Tomorrow at the latest." She looked at Nadia's photograph again. The young woman with the open face. Architecture. She had been studying. Buildings. "I can get it," Sienna said. "If I go back, no," he said. And it was the first time he had said something to her with that particular edge. Not a request, and not a calculation. Something closer to panic compressed into a monosyllable. "What I did with your number was wrong regardless of the outcome," he said. "I'm not compounding it by putting you in a position where I'm not asking your permission," she said. It was the same thing she had said in the kitchen about going back to work, with the same steadiness. And she watched the same thing happen behind his expression, a reassessment, reluctant and complete. "Listen to what I'm proposing," she said. "I have his GPS. He's still at the apartment. If the briefcase is still there and the Rivera contact has left, I can go in, confirm what's in it, and document it with the watch. The watch records locally. He can't take anything from me he can't see." Caius was very still. She could see the war in him between the 2 years of careful strategy and the hour he had arrived too late for Nadia, and the 17 days of coffee and library, and the calculation that had become something he hadn't calculated. "I can't protect you inside that apartment," he said. "I'll call you when I'm in," she said. "You can be in the car outside. If I don't call within 20 minutes, you come up." He looked at her for a long moment that was the longest she had experienced in this house, which was saying something. And in that long moment, she thought she saw everything he was. All the layers she had been building a vocabulary for since the first night, the readiness and the grief and the calculation and the thing that had become not calculation, all of it visible at once, without the architecture that usually governed his face. 20 minutes, he said. Not 21. She stood up. "I'm going to change," she said, and turned toward the door. And stopped. For what it's worth, she said, not turning back around. Looking at the half-erased diagram on the whiteboard, I knew you'd answered the phone that night on purpose before you told me. I knew there was something about the way you said his name the first time. I stayed anyway. She left the study. She heard, very quietly, in the room behind her, the sound of him exhaling not relief, something more complex, the specific sound of a burden setting down a portion of its weight. She changed into dark clothes and she called her lawyer from the upstairs hallway and gave a one-sentence update. And then she came downstairs with her coat and her smartwatch charged to full and her phone and nothing else. And Caius was in the foyer with his own coat and the car keys in his hand. He did not say anything. He drove. The GPS put Elliot at the apartment building still, which meant the briefcase was either there or already gone. And she was betting on there. Elliot moved carefully, and a Saturday afternoon transfer of a physical case through a building with security cameras was more risk than his profile suggested he would take without a specific instruction from Rivera to move. She took those odds. It was the architecture way of thinking. Actually, before you began a structure, you identified which loads the existing conditions would bear. And you built from that. The car parked half a block from the building. She looked at the building. Caius was looking at her. You don't have to do this, he said. You know that. I know, she said. I want to. She meant it. And meaning it felt clean and specific. The feeling of a decision that was hers, not made under pressure. Not made to please or placate. Not made from the old architecture of trying to be useful enough to stay. She wanted the thing in that briefcase. She wanted it for Nadia, who had been 23 and studying architecture, and she wanted it for Caius standing in a hallway at 1 a.m. in the dark, and she wanted it for herself. For 3 years of trusting the wrong thing, and she wanted it in the way you wanted things when you had finally gotten clear on what you were fighting for. She went up in the elevator alone. The hallway was empty. She knocked and Elliot opened the door and his face did the familiar thing, the apology reasserting itself over whatever he had been wearing in private. She stepped inside and said, I thought about it. You said you had something to show me about Caius. Show me now and I'll consider your 48 hours. It was the right move. She saw it work in him. The relief of the narrative he had prepared being called upon. The smooth engagement of a plan he was ready for. He moved to the kitchen where the briefcase was still on the floor behind the counter, which answered the most important question, and he reached for his phone. Not the briefcase, which told her the documentation he meant to show her was digital. A curated selection, not the full record. While he unlocked the phone, she moved her left arm slightly, activating the watch recording. She kept her eyes on his face and let him show her photographs of Caius's history, real photographs, sourced from real records. The kind of damaging-looking documentation that existed for anyone in Caius's position if you selected carefully and removed context. She nodded as he spoke. She kept her arm angled. And then she said, What about the Rivera connection? You mentioned you were closing something out. I want to understand what you're in. He looked up from the phone. That's not relevant to, if I'm going to make a decision, she said. I need to understand what I'm walking into. What did you give them? He looked at her. Something in his eyes shifted. A reassessment. She could see him running. And she thought for a moment that she had pushed too far, been too specific, asked the exact wrong question at the exact wrong time. He set the phone down on the counter. His hand went to the briefcase. He entered the combination. She had her arm angled and her watch recording, and he opened the lid toward himself, away from her. But she had been watching the angle and she moved slightly and saw the interior stacks of printed documents, a sealed drive, a physical folder with Rivera's letterhead on the tab. Exactly what Caius had described. She was recording. She watched Elliot reach into the briefcase and remove a single document and close the lid. He turned to face her. What Draven hasn't told you, Elliot said, and his voice had changed, the softness gone. Something harder and more direct replacing it. is that Nadia wasn't just killed. She was killed because she was going to testify. She had evidence of something I did 2 years before she died, and she was going to give it to an investigator. Caius knows this. He has known it for years. He has known, specifically, that the person who warned Rivera about her testimony schedule was someone inside his own organization. Not me. She went still. What are you saying? I'm saying there's someone in the Draven house who still works for Rivera. Elliot said. And Caius knows. And he has never moved against them because moving against them would require explaining how he knows. Which would require explaining what he's been doing for 2 years. Which includes this. He gestured at her. At the situation. At the whole construction of the last 17 days. She stared at him. She thought about Caius in the foyer tonight. Waiting. She thought about the open study door. She thought about all the things he had told her that were true, and whether the space between the true things left room for the thing Elliot was describing now. She thought about whether she believed Elliot Vane. Specifically. On this specific point. And that was where the calculus broke down in his favor. Because she did not. She did not believe Elliot Vane. She did not believe that a man who had stood outside a closed door in the dark and told her about his sister with his face unguarded was simultaneously running a 2-year cover-up of the internal source of her death. She did not believe this. She also understood, holding all of it at once, that not believing it was not the same as knowing it was false, and that she was standing in Elliot Vane's apartment with a watch recording his briefcase, and she had approximately 4 minutes before the 20 he had given Caius ran out. I need to think, she said. Yes, said Elliot. You do. And his hand was still on the document he had removed from the briefcase. And something in the quality of his attention on her had changed, a sharpening, a focus. The particular attention of someone who has just revealed a piece of information and is waiting to see which way it moves. She looked at his hand on the document. She looked at the briefcase. She said, "Can I use your bathroom?" He nodded toward the hallway. She went. She closed the door and ran the water and pulled out her phone and typed fast. He's trying to muddy it. Briefcase documented. Has Rivera letterhead folder and sealed drive. 20 minutes almost up. She hit send to Caius and pocketed the phone and stood at the sink with the water running and looked at herself in the mirror, the woman in the dark clothes with the smartwatch recording on her wrist, and thought that she had come here to get evidence and she had gotten it, and now she needed to get out. She turned off the water and walked back to the living room, and Elliot was standing near the door, not blocking it, but near it. And the document in his hand was gone. The briefcase was gone. The counter was empty. She looked at the counter and then at him and understood that the 22 seconds she had been in the bathroom had been enough for Elliot Vane to make a call. You should go, he said. His voice was different now, not soft, not frightened, not performing anything, just flat and direct and with a quality in it that she recognized from Caius sometimes. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was now in the execution of it. Okay, she said, and walked toward the door. And he stepped aside. And she walked out. And in the hallway outside she moved fast toward the elevator and hit the button and stood watching the numbers and told herself not to look back at the apartment door. And the elevator came and she got in, and the doors closed, and she pressed the lobby button, and she looked at her watch and stopped the recording and thought, I have it. I have enough. She also thought he moved the briefcase in 22 seconds. Which means the call had already been made. Which means whoever he called is already moving. Which means the car outside is the only place she needed to be. The lobby was empty. The street door was ahead of her. She pushed through it and walked the half block to where Caius had parked. And the car was there, and Rafe was behind the wheel, and Caius was standing outside the passenger door. Not waiting. Walking toward her the moment he saw her come out of the building. And his face had that particular quality it had in the foyer tonight. Stripped of everything that was not genuine. And he said, Are you hurt? No. She said, I got it. All of it. She held up her wrist and he looked at the watch and looked at her face and said, Get in the car. And she got in the car. She expected him to ask about the footage immediately. He didn't. He got in beside her and looked at her for a long moment and said, "You were in there longer than 20 minutes. 23, she said. He tried to tell me Nadia was going to testify, that there's a source inside your house still working for Rivera." He was quiet. She watched his face. "Is that true?" she said. He looked at her with the specific quality she had come to associate with information that had edges she hadn't found yet. And then he said, "There was someone, past tense. They're gone." She looked at him. "Gone as in left. Gone, as in, gone," he said, with the flatness that meant exactly what it sounded like. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked out the window at the street. She thought about what past tense meant in this world, in the geography of decisions that Caius Draven made, and she thought that she was going to have to be all right with a great many things she was not entirely comfortable with if she intended to continue knowing this man, and she thought that she had intended this for longer than she had admitted to herself. And she thought that 23 minutes in Elliot Vane's apartment had confirmed for her, beyond any available doubt, which version of reality she was choosing to live in. "I need to send the footage to my lawyer tonight," she said. "And to the FBI contact," he said. "Yes," she said. "And tomorrow morning I need you to show me the room at the end of the hall." A pause, long and specific. "Yes," he said. Again. She looked out the window at Chicago going past in the dark, the bridge and the lake and the lights of the buildings she had spent 5 years drawing for other people. And she thought about what she would draw when she was ready to draw for herself. And she thought that the shape of it was beginning to come clear. She sent the footage to her lawyer from the car, with a 6-paragraph explanatory note, and her lawyer replied within 10 minutes, confirming receipt and flagging that the Rivera letterhead folder and sealed drive, visible in the recording, matched descriptions. In a federal file he was already tangentially aware of. He forwarded to his FBI contact. Caius made 2 phone calls in the same period, both short, both in a language she could follow, but in references she couldn't, names and numbers and a specific verb repeated twice that she did not ask about. By the time they reached the North Shore gate, the recording had been received by 3 separate parties in 2 different agencies and was in the hands of Caius's own attorney. By the time she went upstairs to wash her face, the secured drive that had been in Elliot's briefcase was being transported by someone Rafe had placed at the building. Caius did not tell her this directly. She inferred it from the phone call and the fact that when she came back downstairs, he was looking at something on a tablet with the expression of a man who had just confirmed what he needed to confirm. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him for a moment without saying anything. He looked up. She said, "What's on the drive? Transaction records," he said. 17 months of routing from the Draven network to Rivera through 6 holding companies. Complete chain. She nodded. She poured a glass of water and drank half of it. "Is it enough?" "It's everything," he said, and his voice when he said it had a quality she had not heard before, not the readiness, not the flatness of grief managed into structure, something quieter and more vulnerable. The quality of a person arriving at the end of a very long road and being surprised to find that the arrival felt different from how they had imagined it. She set down her glass. She looked at him across the kitchen, and she thought about Nadia in the photograph with the open face. And she thought about what it cost to carry something for 2 years and then put it down. And she said, "You should sleep." He looked at her. "You should too," she said. "Tomorrow you're going to show me the room," he said. "Tomorrow." Neither of them moved for a moment. And the kitchen was very quiet. And the house around them had a different quality than it had had for the last 17 days, not the house of an operation, not the house of a grief that had hardened into infrastructure, but the house of something that was not yet named and was beginning to be. She did not sleep well. Not from fear, the fear had burned off somewhere between the elevator and the car outside the building, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that had been operating at full capacity for too long and did not know how to downshift. She lay in the room at the top of the left stairs and looked at the ceiling and went through the evening in sequence Elliot's face when she walked in. The way it arranged itself, and then didn't, the briefcase combination. 4 digits. She had seen his hand move and had not been able to read it, but the recording would show the angle, the interior of the case. The Rivera folder. The sealed drive, his voice going flat at the end. That specific flatness that was not Caius's flatness. Caius's flatness was the result of compression. Something held in Elliot's was the result of emptying. Something given up. She thought about what he had said about Nadia and the testimony. And she thought about the way Caius had answered there was someone. Past tense. They're gone. She thought about what she had chosen to believe, and whether she had chosen it for the right reasons or only the convenient ones. She sat with that for a while. She thought that the capacity to examine your own reasons was different from the capacity to be certain about them, and that she had been certain about Elliot for 3 years and had been wrong, and that being wrong about someone you had trusted completely was the kind of experience that restructured your relationship to certainty permanently. She was not certain about Caius. She had not been certain about him from the first night. What she had was something different, a sequence of evidence. Small and specific, assembled over 17 days, that formed a pattern she believed in even when she couldn't see the whole of it. She believed in the open study door. She believed in the way he had said Nadia's name in the kitchen, with the flatness of grief managed into structure, and the moment when the structure came down in front of her. She believed in the library and the Cortázar and the question he had asked about what she drew when no one was watching. She believed in the foyer tonight. The specific quality of his standing there waiting, the way he had said, "Are you hurt?" before he asked about the footage. These were the things she had. They were enough. She turned on her side and closed her eyes and let herself believe they were enough. And somewhere after 3 in the morning she slept. The FBI contact called Caius at 6:30 in the morning. She heard his voice through the floor, not the words, just the register, and the particular cadence that told her the call was consequential. She got up and made coffee. He came downstairs at 7, and from the quality of his stillness, she understood that the call had contained what they needed, and also something else. He poured coffee and stood at the window, and she waited. They moved on Elliot at 5 this morning. He said, "Apartment." He was there. She nodded. Rivera's U.S. operations are frozen pending the investigation. He said. The drive had 3 years of records. Not 17 months. There were other names. He paused. "Caillou," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her and said, "Among the names on the drive was a record of the payment that was made 2 years before Nadia died. To the person who first gave her location to Rivera." She waited. "The name on the payment was Elliot Vane," he said. "Not the server location. Not the holding company. His name. Directly. From an account in his name. Because he made the first contact before he understood how to cover himself. He was less careful then." She sat very still. She held the coffee cup and thought about a young woman with an open face who had wanted to go to Paris to study buildings. And she thought about the particular quality of Elliot's voice in the apartment last night. The flatness. The decision already made. And she thought about the last 3 years and the Sunday dinners and the careful performance of a man who moved through the world leaving only what he wanted people to find. "He killed her," she said. Not as a question. He gave the order. Caius said, "It's not the same thing in law, but it's the same thing." She looked at the counter. The second cup. Hers. She had poured it herself this morning. And she was the only one here. She thought about all the parallels she had been moving through and the ones she kept coming back to. That she had been close to this man for 3 years and had not known what was underneath him. And that Nadia had been close to him for 4 months and had found it and had tried to say so, and had been silenced for it. She thought about what it meant to find something in someone that they did not want found. She thought about herself, in the apartment, recording a briefcase and asking about Rivera and walking out through a lobby with evidence on her wrist. She thought that Nadia had been braver than her and had paid for it. and she thought that she had been protected by things she had not earned. And she thought that what you did with that kind of unevenness was something she was going to have to sit with for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. It was not enough, and she said it anyway. "You keep saying that," he said, not unkindly. "Each time it sounds different." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the unguarded quality she had first seen in the kitchen when she asked about Nadia. The face without the architecture of readiness. And it occurred to her that he was showing her that face more often now, incrementally, like a window being opened in degrees. "It means something different each time," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "The room. I said I'd show you today." She set down her coffee cup. "Yes," she said. "You did." He took her upstairs at 9 in the morning, down the hallway to the door that was always closed, the one she had found him standing outside of at 1 in the morning 3 weeks ago. He stopped in front of it for a moment the way she had seen him stop before, the old reflex. The old discipline of not opening things that hurt, and then he turned the handle and opened the door and stepped aside to let her in first. The room was not what she had imagined. She had imagined it dark, possibly emptied, possibly filled with the particular absence of a person who was gone. It was instead a room that was still inhabited in the way that preserved rooms were inhabited, a desk with papers still on it, a bookshelf that held specific books with specific spine creases, a drafting table in the corner with a drawing board, and a set of architectural pencils still in their case. On the wall above the drafting table were pinned several sketches building elevations, bridge studies, the particular hand of someone who was learning to see structures as both technical problems and aesthetic ones, the hand of a student in the early years of understanding what they loved. She stood at the drafting table and looked at the sketches and felt the weight of the room settling around her. The weight of a life that had been organized around a specific love and a specific future and had been interrupted, violently and permanently, by a person with no right to do it. She felt Caius behind her, standing near the door, giving her the room. She turned around. He was looking at the sketches, not at her, and his expression was the most honest thing she had seen in her life, not sadness exactly, though that was part of it, but the face of someone who had learned to live alongside an enormous thing and was still learning and had not yet finished. "She was good," Sienna said. "Yes," he said. She was getting better. She looked at the bridge study on the upper left, a simple suspension study, the lines clean and confident for someone still in their first year. She had the instinct for load, Sienna said. You can see it in how she distributed tension. A lot of students default to symmetry. She was thinking about force. He looked at her. Is that he started? And stopped. What she said. You can tell all that from a first-year sketch, she almost smiled. I can tell it from 10 years of making myself useful in buildings other people designed, she said. After a while you learn to see what someone understands and what they're just copying. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sketches. She would have been exceptional, he said. It was the truest thing he had ever said to her, delivered with the particular simplicity of a grief that had been lived with long enough to become not smaller, but more precise. She stood in the room with him and she thought about buildings and the people who designed them and the people who stood in them long after the designer was gone. And she thought that this was what she wanted to do with the drawings she kept in her own drawer, not designs for other people's visions, not plans for structures she did not own, but something that was hers, that would stand because she had understood something and committed it to reality. She looked at the bridge study again. Can I come in here again, she said. When I want to. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She nodded. She turned back to the sketches and looked at them a little longer, and he stood at the door and let her. And the room held them both in the way that rooms held people when they were finally ready to be in them. The call from Sienna's lawyer came on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the FBI moved on, Elliot at 5 in the morning in the apartment she had once called home. The lawyer's name was David Park, and he had the specific quality of someone who communicated urgency without performing it. and he told her that the federal investigation had expanded and that Elliot Vane's attorney had contacted him with a proposal. Elliot would provide testimony naming 3 additional Rivera operatives in exchange for reduced charges. And as part of that arrangement, Elliot's attorney wanted to confirm that Sienna would not be filing any additional civil claims that could complicate the federal timeline. Sienna listened to the entire explanation with the coffee cup in both hands and her eyes on the kitchen window. And when David Park finished, she said, "What do I get if I agree to that?" David Park said. "Nothing. Legally. And if I don't agree, the federal case proceeds with or without your cooperation," he said. "Your civil options remain open, but Elliot's attorney has indicated that if a civil claim complicates things, they'll fight it." She thought about that for a moment. "What does Caius's attorney say?" I'd ask him. David Park said, "But my read is that the federal case doesn't need you to hold off civilly. It's strong enough without that. Agreeing to Elliot's terms would be a concession you don't have to make." "Then I don't make it," she said. David Park said, "Noted," in the tone of a man who had expected this. She hung up and set the coffee cup on the counter and thought about Elliot in federal custody. Still managing. Still calculating. Still finding the angle that might reduce the weight of what he had done. She thought about Nadia's room at the end of the hall and the bridge study with the clean, confident lines. She thought about what concessions she owed a man who had given her ex-fiancé's name to people who used it to take someone's life and had then spent 3 years eating Sunday dinner in her kitchen. She owed him nothing. She told David Park to proceed with the civil filing by end of the week, but it turned out that Elliot Vane's attorney was not the only variable she had underestimated in the days following the arrest. The Rivera organization, the U.S. arm of it, which was frozen pending investigation, had a compliance structure she had not known about, which was a charitable way of saying they had people whose specific purpose was to neutralize threats to that compliance. And one of those people contacted Caius's attorney on a Wednesday with a communication that Caius told Sienna about at dinner that evening, with the specific flatness in his voice that meant the information was serious, and he was deciding how serious she needed to understand it to be. "They want the drive back," he said. She looked at him. "The FBI has the drive. They know that," he said. "What they want is assurance that the names on the drive won't be acted on in a specific jurisdiction where the statute of limitations creates a particular window. They want someone with influence over the federal timeline to apply pressure." She thought about this. "Someone like you. Apparently," he said. "They believe I have reason to want the investigation narrow." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I want the investigation to be exactly as broad as it needs to be to close what happened to Nadia," he said. "Nothing more. Nothing less. And if you don't cooperate with their request," he looked at his plate. "They have people in the building," he said. "Not this building. Not my people. In the federal building. Someone who has access to the evidence chain." She set down her fork. "They're going to tamper with evidence. They're going to try," he said. And his voice had a quality in it. She recognized now the compression, the specific density of a man who had been at this longer than anyone should have to be and was still choosing to be here rather than let it go. "Caius," she said, "you have to go to the FBI directly. Tonight." "I know," he said. "I'm going. I'm going with you," she said. He looked at her across the table. "That's not necessary," she said. "No," he said. "It's not necessary." But he stopped. She looked at him and waited for the end of the sentence, and he looked at her and seemed to arrive at the decision that the end of the sentence was going to be honest whether he wanted it to be or not. "But I would like it," he said. And the quality of the admission, the specific cost it had taken, given who he was and how he operated, to say something that plain landed in her chest and stayed there. "Then let's go," she said. They went to the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road at 7 in the evening, not announced, not scheduled, but with enough of a name and enough of a file number that the duty agent met them in a conference room within 20 minutes. Sienna sat at Caius's right and said almost nothing. But she watched the room, and she watched Caius, and she watched the agent, whose name was Reeves, and who had the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to be unimpressible and was, faintly, impressed. Caius laid out the communication from Rivera's compliance structure, named the person in the federal building who had been identified as their contact in the evidence chain, and provided documentation that Sienna had not known he had until he produced it from the inside pocket of his coat phone records. A financial transfer, a chain of communication going back 11 months that connected the federal employee to a holding company in the same network as the one on the drive. Reeves listened to all of it without writing anything down, which meant he was recording. And at the end he said, "How long have you had this?" Caius said. "Long enough that it's complete." Reeves looked at him for a moment, and then at Sienna, and then back at Caius and said, "The federal employee named here will be in custody by end of business tomorrow." Caius said, "Tonight would be better." Reeves said, "Tonight." Then, they left the building at 8:45 and stood on Roosevelt Road in the November cold, and Sienna looked at the street and felt something shift that had been shifting for days. A weight redistributing itself toward something that was not yet resolution but was the immediate precondition of it. "It's not over," she said. "No," Caius agreed. "The investigation will take months. Elliot's case will take longer." "I know," she said. "I didn't say I needed it to be over." He looked at her. "What do you need?" She thought about it. Genuinely. Standing on Roosevelt Road at 8:45 in the evening, with the Chicago cold moving through her coat, and the federal building behind them, and the city around them in the specific way Chicago was around you at night. Enormous and indifferent, and full of structures that someone had decided were worth building. "I need dinner," she said. "And I need to call my sister. And I need to go back to work on Monday." She paused. Not in that order. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not the calculation, and not the readiness, and not even the exposure she had seen in the kitchen and the study. It was something warmer and more specific, something that had a direction, that was pointed at her rather than at the general space around her. "I know a place," he said. "For dinner." "Of course you do," she said, and he almost smiled. And that almost smile was one of the things she added to the list in her notes app that she was still keeping. And she thought she was going to need a different category for it. The restaurant was small and warm and on a side street in River North that she had walked past 50 times and never entered. He knew the owner, who seated them without a reservation and did not hover. And they ordered things they didn't discuss. And she called her sister from the table because Mira had been texting increasingly pointed messages for 4 days and deserved an actual voice on the other end. She told Mira a curated version enough to be honest, not enough to require a 3-hour conversation on a Tuesday night. Mira said, "Are you actually okay?" Sienna said. "I actually am," Mira said. "Is this person your case?" Sienna looked across the table at Caius, who was looking at the wine list with the specific attention of a man who had decided not to listen to a phone call that was happening 2 feet from him. "He's complicated," she said. "He's a good person who operates in a complicated world." She heard Mira's specific silence, which meant Mira was deciding how much weight to put on that. "Can I meet him?" Mira said. "Eventually," Sienna said. "Okay," Mira said, which for Mira was a significant concession. "Call me when things settle down." "I will," Sienna said, and meant it, and hung up. She set the phone on the table and looked at Caius, who lowered the wine list and looked back. "She wants to meet you," Sienna said. "Eventually," he said, with a quality in the word that indicated it was not alarming to him but rather ordinary. A future event being placed on a calendar that was presumed to exist. She looked at him for a moment. "You already knew I was going to say that," she said. "I know that you're someone who does things in sequence and with intention," he said. "Eventually" was the right word for where we are. She looked at the word "where we are" and did not put it away. "Where are we?" she said. He set the wine list down entirely and looked at her with the completely unguarded quality of a man who had decided, sometime in the last few hours or the last few days, that the architecture that usually governed his face was not going to be useful for the conversation they were about to have. "I don't know the name for it yet," he said, "but I know what it is." She looked at him across a small restaurant table in River North, with the November city outside and a federal investigation building toward whatever it was going to be, and a civil filing in process and her suitcase still in the room at the top of the left stairs, and she thought that a person could spend a long time trying to name a thing before realizing that the naming was secondary to the having of it. "Okay," she said, the same word Mira had used, with the same weight, a significant concession disguised as an ordinary one. He looked at her and the almost smile was there again. A degree past almost. A degree into actual, and she thought she would remember it precisely. The specific geography of Caius Draven's face, arriving at something that was not calculation or readiness or grief, but the particular expression of a man who was, against his own significant odds, having a good night. She did not move back to the apartment. She told her firm on Wednesday that she would return the following Monday, and she arranged for the remainder of her things to be moved from the North Shore left room to a temporary storage unit until she found a place, and she started looking at apartments in the neighborhoods she had always wanted to live in and never had for various reasons, and she now understood as reasons that were really Elliot's reasons imported into her life under the flag of shared preference. She found a building in Logan Square. A pre-war 6-flat with good bones and problematic plumbing and a top-floor unit with windows on 3 sides that she stood in for 40 minutes doing things in her head that were probably too early to do in anyone else's head and that she was going to do anyway. She signed the lease on a Friday. She told Caius on Saturday. They were in the kitchen and she told him she had found a place and he listened to the description of it, the bones, the plumbing, the 3-sided windows with the attention he gave to everything she said about buildings. The specific attention of someone who understood that the way a person talked about a space told you something about the shape of their interior life. "When do you move in?" he said. 3 weeks, she said. "After the holidays." He nodded. She looked at him. "I'm not going far," she said. He looked at her. "Logan Square is 20 minutes. He said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I said." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I'd like to see it." "The building. The bones are good," she said. "The plumbing needs someone who knows what they're doing." "I know someone," he said, with the complete confidence of a man who had spent his life solving problems by knowing the right person for them. "Of course you do," she said, for the second time in a week, and this time he did not almost smile, he smiled. Actually and completely, and she had been waiting for that without knowing she was waiting for it. And it arrived with the particular force of things that have been building toward themselves for a long time. The civil filing went in on the last day of November. David Park sent her a confirmation, and she read it on her phone standing in Nadia's room, where she had taken to going in the mornings sometimes. Not in a morbid way, but in the way you went somewhere that held something important and allowed yourself to be near the importance of it. She had been adding small things to the drafting table, nothing of hers. Nothing that displaced anything already there. Just a second pencil case opened on the side. A pad of trace paper in the corner. She had been making sketches for the first time in 4 years that were for herself and not for anyone else's project. Rough and exploratory, and not good enough yet, but getting better. Which was what she had been the last time she felt this way about her own work, and she had been 22 and in school and everything had been open in the way things were open before you began filling them with other people's priorities. She sketched in Nadia's room in the mornings, and she thought that Nadia had been studying what Sienna had forgotten she loved, and that there was something in that symmetry she was not going to articulate too precisely, because some things were more powerful when you held them loosely. Elliot Vane entered a federal plea agreement on a Thursday in December, 4 weeks and 2 days after the FBI moved on his apartment. The agreement included a full cooperation clause and named 7 individuals in the Rivera organization's U.S. arm and 2 individuals in a separate network that the investigation had identified in the course of examining the drive. It did not reduce the charges related to Nadia Draven to any degree that Caius found sufficient, but Caius's attorney told them both that the federal case would continue beyond the plea and that the specific payment record, Elliot's name, his account, the amount, the date, the destination was now part of a public court record that would not disappear when the plea agreement was concluded. It was not everything. It was not justice in the shape that movies suggested justice took, clean and final and administered in a single blow. It was the kind of justice that was available partial, procedural, incremental, and Sienna sat with Caius in the study and listened to his attorney explain the parameters and watched Caius's face and thought about what she knew, about people who had waited for a long time for something and then received a version of it that was smaller than the waiting. She watched him receive it, the news and the parameters and the shape of what was available, with the same compressed stillness she had catalogued on the first night. The stone into deep water. But this time she was close enough to see that the stillness was different now. Not the stillness of something contained, but the stillness of something set down. When the attorney left, Caius sat at the desk for a moment without speaking, and Sienna sat across from him and said nothing. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable but full, the kind of silence that 2 people made together when they had been through enough to not need to fill it. Then he said, "I need to call my parents. They've been waiting." "Go," she said. "I'll be in the library." He looked at her, and the look was the one she had come to think of as the real one, not the calculation, not the management, but the face underneath all of it, which was the face of a person who had been alone in something enormous for a long time and was, now, not alone. He got up and went to make the call, and she went to the library, and she heard his voice through the door, lower and different than his regular voice, softer at the edges, and she thought that there were many versions of a person and that the version you got depended on what they trusted you to hold, and she was still learning what she could hold and getting better at it. The same way Nadia's sketches had been getting better, which was the only honest way to get better at anything. She moved into the Logan Square apartment on a Saturday in December, 4 days before Christmas. Caius had arranged the plumbing, which was what she had expected. And what she had not expected was that he also arranged for the floors to be refinished before she moved in, not flashy, not a gift in the declarative sense, just a problem identified and solved, which was the vocabulary he used for caring about things. She carried boxes with Mira, who had flown in from Phoenix and who spent the first hour not looking at Caius while definitely looking at him, and who cornered Sienna in the kitchen while Caius was downstairs getting another box and said, he's very, and then trailed off because she apparently did not have the word. "I know," Sienna said. "He looks at you like you're a structural problem he's very glad to have," Mira said. Sienna thought about this. "That might be exactly right," she said. Mira said, "I like him," with the decisive simplicity of someone who had expected not to and had been persuaded. They ordered food and ate it on the floor of the half-unpacked apartment, and Caius sat with his back against the wall and answered Mira's questions with the patience of a man who understood that this was the price of admission and who was prepared to pay it. And Mira asked him about 20 things, and he answered 18 of them honestly and deflected 2 of them in ways that Sienna recognized as deflections and Mira accepted as sufficient. And by 10 o'clock, Mira was calling him by his first name without the quarter-second hesitation she had been using at the beginning of the evening. "She's efficient," Caius said to Sienna. When Mira had gone to the bathroom, "She's Mira," Sienna said. "That's an explanation." He looked at her, and the almost smile was past almost again, and she thought she was going to have to stop counting how many times she had seen it, because she was probably were going to see it for a very long time and the counting would become impractical. Mira left at 11. They stood in the kitchen of the new apartment. which had unpacked boxes in the corners and refinished floors and windows on 3 sides and very little furniture yet. And Sienna looked at the space and thought about what she was going to put in it, and what she was going to draw in it, and who she was going to become in it. And the specificity of those thoughts, how concrete they were. How forward-facing, how different from the thoughts she had been having in this same month 2 years ago, struck her with the particular quality of a recognition that arrived after the fact. The way you recognized morning light only once you had been in it long enough for your eyes to adjust. She turned, and Caius was leaning against the counter watching her look at the room, and his expression was the unguarded one. And she thought that the unguarded one was becoming more frequent, more available. That whatever had been compressed behind it for 2 years was being, slowly and deliberately, released. And that this was the truest thing she had ever watched happen in another person, and she was not going to waste it by being less present than it required. "I don't think I said thank you," she said. "For the floors, you don't need to," he said. "I needed you to have a good apartment." "Why?" she said, already knowing, wanting to hear it. He looked at her, and the look was the real one. And the real one was steady and specific and warm in the way that warmth came from heat that had been genuine all along. "Not assembled, because you're going to draw things in here," he said, "that you've been keeping in a drawer. And I intend to see them." She looked at him for a moment and thought about the drawer and everything she had kept in it and what it meant to intend something out loud to someone who was watching. She crossed the kitchen, which was 4 steps, and she put her hand over his where it rested on the counter. And he turned his hand under hers so that their palms were aligned, and neither of them said anything else for a moment. And the apartment was quiet around them, with the city outside the 3-sided windows and the refinished floors and the unpacked boxes, and it was the most complete silence she had inhabited in 3 years, not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of 2 people who had said the important things and were now simply in the same room together, which was its own language and its own answer. "Stay," she said. Not a request. Not a plea. Not the old architecture of trying to be enough to keep someone from leaving, just a statement of what she wanted, clean and sure as a load calculation, offered without apology. He looked at her. "It's your first night here," he said. "Yes," she said. "Stay anyway." He did. The weeks between the apartment and Christmas were not simple. The federal investigation was a machine that ran on its own schedule, producing developments she learned about in increments from David Park, from Caius. Occasionally from news alerts she had set up on her phone that she kept meaning to turn off and didn't. Elliot's cooperation produced the 7 names in the Rivera U.S. Arm and 2 others, and those names produced arrests and arraignments that appeared in the Tribune in small articles that she read with the specific surreal quality of seeing a thing you were connected to rendered into public record. She had coffee one morning with the FBI agent named Reeves, who wanted her statement about the watch footage on record in a form usable in the federal proceedings, and she gave it in a conference room with David Park beside her. And Reeves thanked her in the particular way of someone who had been doing this long enough to mean it without performing it. She asked him, at the end, how often evidence from a personal device held up the way hers had. He said, more often than people expected, because people underestimated what was routinely accessible when someone was motivated and paying attention. She thought about paying attention. She thought about 17 days of paying attention to a house and a person and the way information arrived there. And she thought that paying attention was something she had been doing her whole life without understanding it was a skill rather than a reflex. She thanked him and left. She went back to the architecture firm on a Monday in early December, as planned. And the first morning was odd in the way that returning to a space you had left under strange circumstances was always odd. The smell of the office, the particular sound of the open floor plan, the specific rhythm of 23 people doing collaborative work in a shared space, her supervisor, a precise woman named Carolyn who had sent 3 check-in emails during Sienna's absence and one email from the firm's HR department that Sienna had responded to minimally, met her at her desk and said, without preamble, "Good. The Lakeview Commission needs your section on structural glazing by Wednesday. I told them we'd have it." Sienna sat down, opened her laptop, and said, "You'll have it Tuesday." Carolyn looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing a variable that had changed since they last looked at it. And then she said, "Good. Again," and went to her own desk. And the morning began. Sienna worked. She worked with the specific quality of someone who had been away long enough to arrive back with a different relationship to the work, not different in output. Not different in the standard she held herself to, but different in the ratio of herself she was holding behind the work versus in it. She put more of herself in. It showed in the structural glazing section, which Carolyn read on Tuesday afternoon and sent back with 2 small corrections, and the note, "Best section you've written for this commission." Sienna filed the note in a folder she was keeping. The folder was titled, "For Her Eyes Only, Building Something." On the Thursday before Christmas, Caius asked her to be at the North Shore house for a dinner. Not a Draven Foundation event. Not anything operational. A dinner with 4 people she had not met. A man named Arlo who had been Caius's closest friend since they were 12. Arlo's wife. Caius's attorney. And Caius' parents, who were wintering in Palm Beach and were, apparently, driving up for the express purpose of meeting her. She stood in the kitchen of her Logan Square apartment with the phone to her ear and said, "Your parents are driving from Palm Beach to Chicago in December to meet me. They wanted to come," Caius said, with the specific quality of a man who had not been able to talk his parents out of something. "Your mother," she said. "It was your mother." He was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. "She may have been the more enthusiastic party," he allowed. She sat on the counter and looked at the 3-sided windows and thought about a woman who had lost a daughter and whose son had been in the specific geography of grief and infrastructure for 2 years, and who had apparently decided, based on whatever Caius had told her, to drive from Palm Beach to Chicago in December. "What did you tell her about me?" she said. "Enough," he said. She looked at the window. She thought about what enough meant. Coming from him. "What did she say?" she said. He was quiet again. "She said it was about time," he said, which was not an elaboration but was somehow a complete picture. Sienna sat on the counter and felt the weight of that, what it meant for a woman who had spent 2 years watching her son be alone in something enormous to say it was about time. What evidence she had gathered from whatever Caius had told her to arrive at that 4-word verdict. She felt it in the chest the way she felt most things that were real. "Okay," she said. "Thursday. Wear the garnet dress," he said. Not quite a request. An opinion dressed as a preference. Which was as close to romantic direction as she had heard from him. "I was going to wear it anyway," she said. He said, almost inaudibly, "I know." She hung up and sat on the counter for a while in the quiet apartment and thought that the architecture of a life was not so different from the architecture of a building. You built from the foundations available to you, and sometimes the foundations were compromised by history or by damage or by the choices of people who had come before you. And what you could do was identify what was load-bearing and what was not, and clear the non-load-bearing elements, and build on what remained in a form that was honest about what it was holding and what it was meant to last through. She had better foundations now than she had 3 months ago. She was going to build something she was proud of. She went to find the garnet dress. The dinner was on Thursday at 7, and by 8:30 she had been adopted by Caius's mother, whose name was Celine, and who had the specific quality of a woman who had survived difficult things without letting the difficulty define what she expected from the world, and who asked Sienna questions about architecture with a genuine interest that Sienna recognized immediately as the same quality that Greta Halverson had at the benefit, the interest of a person who was actually curious about someone other than themselves, which was rarer than it should have been. Arlo's wife was quiet and clever and made a joke about Caius in the second hour that made Arlo laugh and Caius look at her with the exact expression of a man who was outnumbered and at peace with it. Caius's father was tall and said little and had his son's eyes, and watched Sienna the way Caius sometimes watched things with the patient attention of someone who was building a picture over time and did not need to arrive at the conclusion before the evening was over. At one point, near the end of dessert, when the conversation had broken into smaller threads, he leaned across the table and said, very quietly, "He's different since you arrived." She looked at him. Different, how, she said. He considered. "Present," he said. After a moment, "He was here before, but he wasn't present." She looked across the table at Caius, who was talking to Arlo about something, leaning forward slightly, and she thought about the word present and the cost it had taken him to become it, and the specific way he had arrived there. Not gracefully, not without resistance, but genuinely and at the pace that something genuine required. "I know," she said, to Caius's father. He looked at her with something in his expression that was warm and specific and recognized her in a way she had not expected. And he said, "Good," and turned back to his dessert. And she understood that she had been evaluated and found sufficient, and that the evaluation had not been about credentials or background or any of the categories that evaluations were usually about, but about whether she was paying attention. She was. She always had been. She thought that was the thing about her that was worth knowing. The federal case against Elliot Vane concluded its initial phase in February of the following year. With Elliot's cooperation locked in, and the 7 Rivera operatives in custody, and the 2 additional names identified in a separate proceeding that Caius's attorney described as more satisfying, in the appropriate legal sense. The civil case was moving on a longer timeline, as civil cases did. David Park had filed the claim in November and had received the expected response from Elliot's attorney in December, and was now in the phase of pre-trial proceedings that he described to Sienna as methodical and that she understood to mean slow and expensive and ultimately worth it. She had decided, at some point between December and February, that the civil case was not primarily about money. It was about record. It was about the fact that Elliot Vane's name should be publicly attached to a specific set of actions in a document that would exist after the federal proceedings had concluded and the media attention had moved on. Nadia Draven's name should be in that document. The architecture of accountability, like all architecture, needed to be visible to be real. She was building it. It would take time. She was patient with things that mattered. She and Caius had not formally named what they were to each other by February, which was something she had noticed and had decided, after thinking about it carefully, was not a problem. They had named it in practice in the Thursday dinners and the Sunday mornings, and the ongoing project of the Logan Square apartment, which she was furnishing slowly and with the same care she had been giving to her own sketches, one piece at a time, each chosen because it was the right thing in the right place, and not because it was expected. Caius came over on most Saturdays and sometimes on weekday evenings when his schedule allowed it, and she went to the North Shore house on other weekends, and they had established a rhythm that was theirs, not copied from anyone else's template, not fitting itself into any category she had seen available. Just the thing they were doing, which was careful and deliberate and gradually more open on both sides. She showed him the drawer in January. She spread the sketches on the Logan Square dining table, which she had just acquired, and stood back and let him look at them in the way you let someone look at something that cost you something to show. He went through them one by one, slowly, without saying anything, with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he was serious about. He stopped at one, a building study she had done 3 years ago, before Elliot, before she understood what she was trying to draw, a community structure for an underserved neighborhood on the South Side. Low-rise, well-lit, with the kind of communal geometry that she had seen work in the projects she admired and wanted to understand better. He looked at it for a long time. "This one," he said, What happened to it? Nothing, she said. I put it in the drawer. He looked at her. Take it out of the drawer, he said. She looked at the sketch. She looked at him. She thought about Nadia's bridge study with the clean, confident lines and the understanding of load that a first-year student should not have had yet and had anyway. Because some people understood things early and needed space to build on the understanding. I'm going to need a studio, she said. With the right light. Logan Square has good light, he said. Not in this apartment, she said. A proper space. He nodded. The nod of someone who was already solving the problem before she had finished stating it. I know a building, he said. Of course you do, she said. For the third time, and it had become something by now. That phrase. A recurring small note in the vocabulary they were building together. A tiny joke that was also a fact, and also an affection. The kind of thing that belonged to two people and to no one else. She picked up the community building sketch and looked at it for a long moment and thought about who she had been when she drew it, and who she was now, and whether the drawing was still what she believed it was, or whether it needed to be remade from a better understanding of the loads involved. She thought she would remake it. She thought the remaking would be better than the original. She was not afraid of that anymore, of the gap between what you had made and what you knew you could make. Of the distance between the first draft and the true thing. The distance was not a failure. The distance was how you got there. She lay in the dark of the new apartment some time after midnight. In the room with the three-sided windows through which the Logan Square streetlights made long rectangles on the floor. And Caius was beside her, asleep, which she knew from the particular quality of the silence he made when he slept different from the silence he made when he was awake. Less ready. More human. The silence of a person who had finally found somewhere it was all right to put down the readiness for a while. She looked at the ceiling and she thought about all the places she had made herself useful in other people's visions. And she thought about the drawer of her own sketches. The community building study that was now on the dining table and not in the drawer. And she thought about buildings you built, not because someone needed them to be built, but because something in you understood their shape before. They existed and needed to make that understanding real. She thought about Nadia at the drafting table. The bridge study with the clean lines and the understanding of load. The open face in the photograph on the corner of the study desk. She thought that people left things in rooms, in buildings, in the work they had started and not finished, and that what you did with what was left was part of how you honored who had left it. She was going to finish the community building sketch. She was going to find someone to build it. She was going to put Nadia's name somewhere in the acknowledgments of a structure that would exist in the world, real and load-bearing and visible, the way accountability needed to be visible to be real. She did not know yet what form that acknowledgement would take. She knew it would be in a building, because that was the language they shared, her and Nadia, the woman who had been studying what Sienna had forgotten she loved. Across the gap of a death that should not have happened. In the particular conversation that sometimes happened between people who never met but understood the same things. She thought about that for a while in the quiet of the Logan Square apartment, with the streetlights doing their geometry on the floor and the city outside, in the specific way Chicago was outside at 2 a.m, present and enormous and full of structures that someone had decided were worth the load. She had spent a long time choosing doors that looked safe from the outside. She had learned what that cost. The door she had walked through, the one at the end of the wrong text message. The North Shore gate. The library and the hallway and the kitchen and Nadia's room and the federal building and the civil filing and the Logan Square lease and the dinner in River North and the drawer finally open on the dining table, had been the most dangerous-looking door she had ever found. And what was on the other side of it was the truest, most solid thing she had built in years. She was still building it. She intended to be building it for a very long time. And this intention sat in her chest with the particular weight of things that were load-bearing and real and hers. She closed her eyes. Outside the three-sided windows, Chicago held itself up the way it always had, imperfectly. expensively, with more than its share of damaged infrastructure and complicated history, and also with the specific stubborn beauty of a thing that had been decided was worth the trouble of remaining. She thought she understood, finally, why she had always loved this city. She slept,